Time is an illusion. Albert Einstein. Hello, everyone. Good evening. This is kind of a follow-up to the other one that I did. I don't have any answers for you, really. I'm trying to find out why we have those 5 extra days. Not mathematically. Just how did the ancients figure that out? How did even the Catholic Church, the Pope with the Gregorian calendar, why include the 5 extra days? Why keep it? And there's just a lot. Look, the Gregorian calendar, the last time that we changed the calendar that we use today was in 1582. And I'll go into more detail later, but basically it came about because they wanted to sync up Easter to the was the March solstice, the spring solstice, I guess, March 21st. So everyone around the world could celebrate Easter on the same day. I'll go more into that later, but here it is. I have a image that I created, and I will share it with people later. Let me not show myself so you can see the full thing. Where am I? There we go. All right, so it's updated from the last one, and the last one I'll post it on Gab and Twitter. But look, a full circle or circular orbit equals 360 degrees, but a full year with the Gregorian calendar is 365.2425 days. So where did those extra 5 days come from? Way back. I mean, this isn't now. This is just the observations of the Maya and the Egyptians. And look, for at least 4,723 years before Johannes Kepler came up with his 3 laws, we knew the Earth had an elliptical orbit around the sun. Otherwise, we would have 360 days of the year. What's interesting is the Maya calendar, which is before the Egyptian calendar, and whoa, we're going to go into some stuff later. They both had 365 days of the year, but the difference is the Maya, the 5 extra days were to be avoided because they were unlucky, and they were called the Wayeb, W-A-Y-E-B. And the Egyptian calendar, the 5 extra days are there because the birth of Osiris, Horus, Set, Isis, and Nephthys. Now, which is interesting because in Egyptian mythology, the 360 days were actually cursed days of Ra. And so the 5 extra days were the uncursed. So that means it's lucky. So between the Maya and the Egyptian, although they have the exact same number of days in a year, they are quite different. The Maya thought that those 5 days were unlucky, and the Egyptians thought that those 5 days were uncursed days. Now, I'm going to go ahead and show a couple of things from the browser. So let's see, share browser. Here we go. And it's easier just to pick up by just watching a couple of videos. I'm going to show 4 of them maybe, actually. I'll move that over. And then we'll go over a couple of websites for more information. So here we go.
Here we are.
When you're shopping for electronics, Nebraska Furniture Mart has it all. Shop thousands of electronics.
This time and this place. Time and place. Time and place. Time and place. So here you are, in this time and place. Welcome. consciousness always has a location. A calendar is an agreement of a society or a civilization. It is the pinpoint center of any civilization. The absolute dead center of our civilization is called the Gregorian calendar. Nobody even questions it. The Gregorian calendar was the physical measurement of Earth around the sun. The measurement of physical objects moving through space. The absolute dead center of our civilization is focused on only physical evidence. It's the calendar on which all things are bought and sold. Our calendar has directed our consciousness only in that direction, to change or alter your viewpoint, to dominate people's consciousness. It's been that way throughout your whole life. So, here we are, time and place. This time and this place. The Maya had two calendars at the very center of their civilization. The Zolkin calendar was 260 days long. This was celebrated every day by every person. Then we have the Tun calendar, 360 days long. And this calendar is known as the Divine calendar. Every 52 revolutions of this calendar, these two teeth match back up. Every 52 Tun, all debts were absolved, and they started all over. Our calendar only has to do with our speck of mud going around this little speck of light we call the sun, in a sea of 100 billion stars, in this one galaxy out of 100 billion galaxies in the universe. So how big is our calendar? These guys were looking at something a lot bigger. They certainly weren't timing any physical cycles of things in our solar system. What were they timing? The Mayan calendar is in 9 different levels. That's why all those pyramids down there are all 9 levels. That each one of these levels is subdivided into 13 individual sections. There are 7 periods of light, and there's 6 periods of dark. 7 days and 6 nights to each level of creation. Each day is a period of increase in consciousness. And each night is a period of applying that consciousness. This very first cycle started 16.4 billion years ago. It's called the cellular cycle. 16.4 billion years is divided into 13 different sections. Each one of them 1.26 billion years long. A day was 1.25 billion years, and each night lasted for 1.25 billion years. Each one of these has a particular intention in creation. Action, reaction was this whole cycle. The very next cycle started 820 million years ago. And it started going through these same 13 steps. This one was 1.26 billion years each. This one's only 63.4 million years each. This whole cycle fits in that box very comfortably. It's not a coincidence. We're on a schedule. We are on a schedule. The mind. Here, we put down the tail and picked up the mind as a survival tool. The cultural cycle. 8,000 years ago, we developed agriculture. Law. Ooh, the Industrial Revolution. Power. It is now global consciousness.
All right, so I'll play the next one. That was pretty interesting. Here's the next one.
This video tracks the accelerating changes over history. It will demonstrate how significant steps in human evolution have suddenly come into existence at precise times, forming a pattern of profound coincidences which suggests divine guidance. This information is powerfully embedded in the construction of the ancient Mayan long count calendar. Today, the speed of events are dizzying and going ever faster, causing threats to established social institutions and cannot continue the same way. Part 2 of this video will explore the impact and alternatives for the future of humanity. Everyone is sensing that time is getting shorter. But is it time that is really speeding up? Here is an analogy that may help explain the situation. Imagine a ball rolling across a flat surface. The distance traveled each second would be constant, apart from the effect of friction. This is the linear approach that is similar to how we perceive life. However, if a ball was dropped from the top of a tall building, in the first second it would travel 32 feet. But in the next second it would travel 64 feet because of the accelerating force of gravity. It would continue to go faster and faster, exponentially. Now, if you were a microbe on this ball, rather than concluding that time was speeding up, you would realize that it is the distance traveled that is increasing each second. In a similar way, evolution is also accelerating. Time is not speeding up, but the number of events that are occurring each year is increasing. It took 2 billion years from the origin of life to the creation of cells, and just 14 years from the PC to the World Wide Web. Let's take a look at the facts through a different lens, through the lens of the evolution of consciousness. The Mayan calendar is an alternative with striking similarities to the scientific version of evolution, and it provides not only a context, but a structure supported by history, and a history which suggests a meaning of divine importance. Now, everybody's heard of the Mayan calendar and that it comes to an abrupt end in 2012. Interpretations vary anywhere from 2012 is the end of the world to 2012 is the beginning of the Age of Enlightenment. The Mayan civilization lasted well over 1,000 years until being conquered by Hernandez Cortes around 1520. And to give you an idea of the scale of their civilization, around 500 AD, when London was just a small village, at least 2 Mayan cities had populations of over 100,000 people each and had developed the most advanced mathematics and astronomy of their day. Unlike Egyptian history, the history of the Maya is not at all well known, as most of the artifacts were destroyed by the invaders. interest in the Mayan civilization picked up in the most unusual way. During World War II, when the Russian army was storming Berlin, the Berlin Library went up in flames. Yuri Nozorov, a young student from Leningrad, ran in and rescued just one book. It turned out to be a facsimile of the only 3 surviving Mayan codices known at the time. Back in Russia, Yuri spent 7 years breaking the Mayan code which told their history, but it was not until 1994 that Swedish biologist Dr. Carl Johan Kallman became inspired and undertook to devote his career to solve the mystery of the long count calendar and to translate its meaning into modern terms. It's this inspiring viewpoint that I'll be walking us through now, with a structure that demonstrates historical acceleration with incredible precision. The Mayan long count is not a calendar of time, but a schedule of events over time, leading to the evolution of consciousness. And of course, like any schedule, it has a start date and an end date. Here's the interesting part. It's not just one single schedule, but it is made up of 9 overlapping schedules or cycles, each of which is shorter than the one below, and they all end up on the same date. Why? The Maya believe that it takes 9 evolutionary cycles from the beginning of the universe to enlightened consciousness. This core belief is represented in the 9 steps of every Mayan pyramid. In addition, there are 3 special characteristics of the calendar which are the root of its power and prophecy. First, the Mayan mathematicians recognized that the speed of events accelerated with time, just as the ball accelerates when dropped from a tall building. Therefore, the cycles are not just shorter, each one is precisely 20 times shorter than the cycle below. For example, if cycle 2 were drawn to scale, it would be 1/20th of cycle 1. Similarly, this compression would apply to all the other cycles and they would visually collapse into a single vertical row. So for visual clarity, the expanded scale would be used for later explanations. Second, it is noted that a significant evolutionary event emerges at the beginning of each cycle, and this will be explained as we go into the detail of each of the cycles. The third characteristic, that each of the 9 cycles is divided into 13 energy periods, 7 positive and 6 negative. Dramatic changes emerged during the positive periods and became established during the 6 negative periods. Perhaps this gives new meaning to the biblical creation story in Genesis of 7 days and 6 nights. Of course, because the next cycle is 20 times shorter, the changes are 20 times faster, and 20 times faster again for each cycle after that. So let's start at the beginning. The universe came into existence as a huge explosion of energy, commonly known as the Big Bang. The Mayans identified this event as the start of the first cycle of the calendar, and they show it as happening 16.4 billion years ago. How the heck the Mayan mathematicians knew this is a puzzlement. It's pretty close to the latest estimate of modern science of 15 billion years ago. As for the actual end date, no one really knows, and there are many predictions that it's around 2012. However, Dr. Kallman's research is that the schedule ends on the 28th of October 2011, and his is the one I shall be using. So let's take a look at the acceleration that occurred during that first cycle. Very shortly after the Big Bang, atoms formed in a gaseous fog. As the gas expands, it breaks into clouds, which expand and cool, forming the Milky Way. Then supernovas form the beginning of the universe as we know it, and the acceleration continues, until our solar system appeared around 4.7 billion years ago. And on Earth, the essential elements of life, which then formed the first cells, leading to the growth of vegetation around the planet. Until 821 million years BC, and some 16 billion years had passed before the start of cycle 2. Since it is only 1/20th of the size, we've expanded the view for full visibility. Of course, it now represents only 821 million years, and it was around this time that the first simple animal life suddenly sprang into existence. And although it was just a sponge, it represented an unprecedented breakthrough into incredible complexity. Cycle 3, being 1/20th of Cycle 2, starts at 41 million years BC. By remarkable coincidence, this is the same time that the monkey sprang into existence. The timescales are getting much shorter now, with Cycle 4 starting at 2 million years BC. This is around the time that the first humanoid appeared. However, it took another 70 million years for the modern Homo sapiens to evolve. Cycle 5 started at 1,500,000 years BC, coinciding with the emergence of the first languages. Cycle 6 starts at 3,115 years BC, which is also the time that the first writing appeared. The duration has now shrunken down from millions of years to 5,000 years, and we're now in the history where the dates can be more precise. So I've expanded the scale further to give more visibility. Earlier, I mentioned the 13 energy periods of 7 positive and 6 negative, in which important events occurred during the positive period. In this case, each energy period is a leisurely 395 years. Here are a few examples of important events. Currency was invented around 2000 BC. The Buddha was born in 500 BC. And of course, the birth of Jesus was the beginning of our Gregorian calendar. He was followed by the birth of Muhammad around 570 AD. Then moving rapidly along to 1450 AD, the invention of the printing press by Gutenberg and his printing of the Bible revolutionized communications. Cycle 7 starts 1755 AD, and this was also coincident with the invention of the steam engine by James Watt in the mid-1700s. This was the event that triggered the Industrial Revolution, and the length of the energy periods in which change occurs now reduces to 20 years. The steam locomotive was invented by George Stephenson in 1814. Samuel Morse invented the telegraph in 1837, and Carl Benz introduced the automobile in 1885. In 1920, Westinghouse introduced radio programs. Emails went online in 1971, and the World Wide Web was launched in 1990. Now things are really speeding up. Cycle 8 begins 5th of January 1999, and that was the start of the IT revolution, which continues today. The number of events occurring in this cycle was vast, as each energy period of creation is only 12 months. In 2001, the iPhone, then the iPod, the DVD, the digital camera, an oxygen-powered plane, and in 2011, the ubiquitous iPad. And so we come to March 9, 2011, the start of the last cycle, Cycle 9. This cycle has started with momentous events in the Arab world and the Middle East, and I've labelled it the Freedom Revolution. Hang on to your hats, folks. This is a period of unprecedented rate of change, every 18 days. It will be a roller coaster in all areas, societal, natural, financial and political. Now here are just a few of the headlines about countries in the Middle East in March. Tunisia, Egypt, Jordan, Bahrain, Yemen, Syria. 3 important conclusions can be drawn from the Mayan long count. Firstly, the 9 cycles of the schedule accurately demonstrate the acceleration of events from ancient history up to the present day. Secondly, the probability of 9 significant steps in human evolution aligning with the start dates of the 9 cycles is way beyond coincidence, suggesting a divine purpose. Thirdly, the rate of evolution in Cycle 1 is almost static, as it takes 1 billion years for the change to occur. However, by Cycle 9, the frequency has increased to the point where it takes just 18 days for major change to occur, which easily accounts for the turmoil of today. But what comes after the end of the schedule? Will society descend into chaos, as some predict, or will we evolve into a society of compassion and caring? Part 2 of this video explores the stress impact of the speed-up on the human psyche and how heartfelt intuition can open us to the guidance of the soul.
Alright, yeah, there's a lot of weird stuff here, but bear with me. Here's part 2.
So, everything's going faster. We travel faster, we communicate faster, we make things faster, and our transactions are faster. With each advance, human capability increases, and the next second, so do our expectations. We now have the capacity to understand in minutes what it took our ancestors weeks to comprehend. Lowell Cattler, a noted professor at New Mexico University, says that the rate of change of the United States is such that there is new high technology produced in the marketplace every 17 seconds. Here's the rub, though. The one thing that hasn't changed is the speed of our thinking. Let me illustrate. Firstly, the speed at which we process pictures is limited. Since the 1920s, films have always been made with 24 frames a second because anything slower would flicker. Now here's an experiment for you. Move your hand in front of your eyes slowly. Do you notice that it flickers? Now speed it up until it blurs. What about the speed of conscious thought? Conscious awareness comes in flashes. It's not a continuous process. Sir Roger Penrose, an eminent mathematician and physicist, measured that the average person receives about 40 conscious moments per second. Now, high-performing athletes work to a faster level. For example, Joe Namath shared that when he was a peak moment during the game, everything seemed to slow down. And when he was scoring a touchdown and there were literally thousands of people applauding, he saw everything in slow motion and total silence. There was no sound. And the conclusion is he might have gone from, say, 40 conscious moments a second to 100 at that moment. So the situation we now have is that computers process millions of transactions per second, social media communications are nearly instantaneous, but our rational minds only operate at 40 thoughts per second. Today, it's not uncommon for a corporate executive to receive 300 emails per day, and when you are bombarded with more messages and more information than you can possibly respond to, it can get very stressful. In fact, email has been identified as one of the top 10 causes of stress in the workplace, and is having a serious impact on society. Not surprisingly, the rate of increase of stress in the world, which is tracked by the World Health Organization, took a distinct leap after 1999. So, processing speed of the rational mind is 40 flashes a second, and when acceleration of daily events with their expected demands are faster than our rational minds can process, the result is increasing stress, which easily leads to fearful thinking. The good news is that this pattern of thinking can be broken. There's growing experimental evidence that intuition can access needed information at extraordinary speeds, virtually instantaneous. Anecdotally, there are many stories of people who attribute either their success or their avoidance of disaster to an intuitive insight. The intuitive mind can easily keep up with the speed of change and guide us to inspired thinking. An inspiring illustration of the speed of intuition is presented by American author and mystic Carolyn Mace in this brief video clip. Intuition at the speed of the soul. It has a wonderful ring to it.
Personality is your soul or your spirit operating at the speed of time. The consciousness of your spirit in slow motion, operating at the speed of time. So if you can't take the speed of your soul, which is the speed of intuition, you have to have it at the speed of personality, which is the speed of physical time.
Intuition at the speed of the soul. It has a wonderful ring to it. So if accessing intuition is the key to intelligent action in times of tumultuous change, how do we cultivate it? And it's easier than you may think. Scientists have now established that intuition is actually initiated by the heart rather than the brain. Over the last 20 years, there's been a lot of exciting research into this by the Institute of Heart Math. While we all know that our heartbeat increases when we're tense, the breakthrough for heart math was that the variability between each individual heartbeat changed significantly under tension, and this discordant information was being sent to the brain, which dramatically altered a person's mood. For example, with a person feeling frustration, a graph of the variability between the heartbeats is erratic and sends distorted information to the brain, like a harsh discordant sound. However, variability measurements taken with great healers, Dalai Lama monks and inspirational leaders all produced a smooth, coherent pattern, like a peaceful, harmonious sound. Although there are many anecdotal records demonstrating the speed of intuition, many have difficulty believing in the validity of these claims. So next I will describe just one example of a truly extraordinary scientific experiment conducted by HeartMath. The experiment involved 26 participants who viewed a series of pictures presented at random. On pressing a button, a picture appeared on the screen, but only after a delay of 6 seconds, and it lasted for 3 seconds before the screen went blank. Each participant viewed 90 different pictures, which could be either calm nature scenes or pictures that aroused emotional feelings. With this combination, there were over 2,000 trials, making it a very rigorous experiment. So walking through the procedure, the participant presses the button and a random picture appears 6 seconds later. In this case, it's a calm, peaceful picture. The scientists are measuring the change in heart rate variability after the button is pressed. Might help using sound as an analogy. Before the button is pressed, the sound might be like this. As the variability goes negative, the sound distorts with some lower frequencies. And if the variation goes positive, the sound distorts with some higher frequencies. So the graph of the average change in variability for all the calm trials came out as shown, and this became the reference line. However, when emotional pictures were shown, the average graph of the variability went way down from the reference graph. In fact, it started deviating from the reference graph 4.5 seconds before the picture appeared on the screen. Now, because these pictures are based on an average of over 2,000 trials, the odds of this happening by chance alone is over 1,000 to 1. This experiment alone is a pretty compelling illustration that we humans have the capability of tapping into the power of our heart-based intuition to guide our decisions. In the days ahead, how you feel about a decision is going to be far more critical than any logical analysis coming from the rational mind, and we need to do it on a daily basis. This difference is best expressed by Dr. Roland McCratty of HeartMath.
And what we found was that when we're feeling positive emotions, like we're really appreciating the sunset, or really feeling love or compassion or care for someone, that the heart beats out a very different message.
A peaceful message which gives us easy access to intuition. So here we have 3 conclusions. Positive thoughts evoke peaceful feelings, and we can cultivate these emotions in the heart. A peaceful state invites intuitive insights, which are more relevant to cope with the acceleration of events. Intuitive insights are virtually instantaneous and operate at the speed of events. So I leave you with this thought. The evolution reflected by the Mayan calendar heralds mankind's awakening to enlightened consciousness, and how compassionate hearts can lead to a world of peace and harmony.
All right. Here is the next one. It's a short one, 2 minutes. It's just kind of breaking the Maya code. It's a documentary, but this one is a short snippet on the Maya calendar. It's not going to go into the other stuff. This is just more detail.
Gradually, Firsterman worked out how the Maya marked time, a system now called the calendar round. The calendar round is made up of 3 interlocking cycles: a 365-day solar year, a cycle of 20 names, and a cycle of 13 numbers. Days are designated by the way these 3 cycles line up. For example, this day is 3 Manik, and the 14th of the month Pope, followed by 4 Lamat, 15 Pope, 5 Muluk, 16 Pope, and so on. 52 years will pass before the 3 cycles line up in the same way again. Then, these days will repeat. Like our days of the week, the calendar round cycles on and on forever. It is not by itself tied to any specific starting point in history. But Firsteman's greatest triumph came when he realized that some very large numbers in the Venus pages of the Dresden were counts back in time. They tied the Venus records to an historical starting point thousands of years earlier. It fell on the calendar round day 4 Ahau 8 Kumku. From Maudsley's photographs, Firsteman knew that this extraordinarily ancient date appeared throughout the Maya world, from Palenque in northern Chiapas to Quirigua in southern Guatemala. Firsteman concluded that for the Maya this date marked the creation of the universe. Just as Western culture measures its history from the birth of Christ, so the Maya measured their history from the date of creation. This system of dating is known as the long count.
I'm gonna have to watch that full thing. That looks pretty interesting. All right, so then that's just a little bit brief, just videos, just so you could watch. Here we're gonna go into a little bit more of just written articles. History.com. So the Maya Empire, centered in the tropical lowlands of what is now Guatemala, reached the peak of its power and influence around the 6th century AD. The Maya excelled at agriculture, pottery, hieroglyphic writing, calendar making, and mathematics, and left behind an astonishing amount of impressive architecture and symbolic artwork. Most of the great stone cities of the Maya were abandoned by AD 900. However, since the 19th century, scholars have debated what might have caused this dramatic decline. And talks about the location, and just so what's weird, I wonder if I can see. All right, so both the Maya and the ancient Egypt across each other in the Atlantic Ocean both used a calendar of 365 solar days, not 360, 365 days. Now what's interesting is the stories behind it, even though it's still pretty much a mystery in the Maya, and we'll get into a little bit later. But the Maya added the 5 extra days. They understood that there's 365 days out of the year, not 360, even though a full circle, full complete orbit would be 360 degrees. They knew that the orbit around the sun, well, maybe they thought it was the orbit around the earth, who knows, but it seems to be see, that's the thing. I was trying to look for, has there been any models created of what would be the difference in the solar calendar if indeed the sun orbited the earth and not the earth orbited the sun? Would it be exactly the same or would it be slightly different? It's mathematically a mathematic model, whatever. I couldn't find anything, because we're going to go into that a little bit later with Galileo and the Catholic Church. So these two civilizations, which had pyramids and were based on the solar calendar, and I don't think at this time the Egyptians, at least a lot of scholars these days, they didn't know that there was an America across a great ocean. The Maya, do you think they had the capabilities across the Atlantic or even the Pacific and whatever great body of ocean that they can cross to get to Egypt and compare notes and say, hey, It's 365 days, not 360 days. Wait, what? You guys came with the same conclusion? So, but the thing is, the reasoning for it is like, oh yeah, we have 360, we have 5 extra days in the year instead of 360 because of, well, those are just unlucky days for the Maya, and for the ancient Egypt, it's because 5 deities were born during those 5 extra days. That's the reasoning. With all this great math, all this great architecture, their reasoning for those 5 extra days were mythological, just a story based. It's or did they just figure the 5-day anomaly instead of being an elliptical orbit was just based on some, they just had to come up with an idea and they figured, hey, why not come up with a story? I don't know. I guess they got nothing else to do. They didn't have TV back then, or did they? Okay. All right, so you could read more about that. The Mayan calendar, just did a couple of searches and whatever came up. Now, how does the Mayan calendar work? The video that I showed last kind of gives you the best idea. And one of the things that I liked is how those three circles, 3 of those wheels, I don't know what you would call them, when every time they line up to the exact position, it's 52 exact years. It's not 52.3 whatever. For example, the Hab is a 365-day solar calendar, which is divided into 18 months with 20 days each, and 1 month which is only 5 days long. Slightly different than the Egyptian or maybe even Sumerian. The calendar, the outer ring of Mayan glyphs, which represent each of the 19 months. It's like, what? Each of the 19 months? I have 18 months? Okay, so keep reading. Each day is represented by a number in the month, followed by the name of the month. Each glyph represents a personality associated with the month. The Hab is somewhat inaccurate, as is exactly 365 days long. An actual tropical or solar year, the time it takes Earth to orbit the sun takes about 365.24219 days on average. In Gregorian's calendar, we adjust for this discrepancy by making almost every 4th year a leap year, which an extra day. A leap year is added on 29th of February. Yeah, just so they just changed Julian calendar slightly in order to make sure that Easter fits in the same on the March solstice. Okay, so the long count, etc., and it goes into a whole bunch of other stuff. Now it doesn't get into the story of why the 5 extra days. So here's another one on History on the Net. It talks about the Hab, slightly different than the timeanddate.com. HistoryOnTheNet.com says the solar calendar or Hab has 365 days made up of 18 months of 20 days each, which adds up to 360 days. Correct, which the other site didn't do. The remaining 5 days at the end of the year is an unlucky, dangerous time known as the Wayeb. Mayans stayed home and neglected all activities during this time to avoid disaster. Now this is different because those 5 days in Egypt and those 5 days within the current religious areas are known as very, I guess, very lucky or very good. Interesting. So in the Hab calendar, a day is represented by a number in the month and the name of the month. There were 19 month names plus Wayeb for the dreaded 5-day month, making 20 month names. So there was an extra month that included the 5-day month, making 20 month names. There was a picture here. Now there was a mathematical thing that I wanted to show, and I'm not sure if I could remember it. Had something to do with the Sulcan, with the 52 years. Let's see if I can remember it. Okay, so 52 years. Something I'm missing here. I'm trying to find it. And here is just the Wikipedia, but it kind of shows you the Wayeb, which is the 5 unlucky days, which is the 19th month. This is the symbol that was shown. This is an interesting symbol. I haven't really figured out what exactly it might look like. Maybe the Eye of Horus. Doesn't it look a little bit like the Eye of Horus? Except instead of a, I don't know. Let's look at the Eye of Horus. Might as well. Okay, maybe it doesn't look like the Eye of Horus. I just thought of that might have. I adjust. Maybe no. Okay, anyways, I just wanted to point that out there. Anything else? So the thing is, if let's see. Let me get the calendar out, or calculator, I'm sorry. All right, so 52 years divided by 365. Hey, that doesn't make sense. No. Something is wrong here. I don't know where it was. I think it was in the first video. I'm trying to find it here.
And this calendar is known as the divine calendar. Every 52 revolutions of this calendar, these two teeth match back up. Every 52 tune, all debts were...
Maybe not. I did the calculations before. I don't know why I can't find it now. Let's see. 260? Maybe that was it. Maybe. So 260 times 365. Oh shoot. No. What was it? 52. I will figure out where it is. So this one is talking more about it. Okay, so the 260-day calendar, known as the sacred calendar Zolkin in Maya, has 20 days associated with the numbers 1 through 13. 20 times 13 equals 260. It would run as follow, and gives more details. So every day was significant in the astrological chart. Notice that the Maya did not have numbers like ours. They only had 3 digits, a dot standing for 1, a bar standing for 5, and a shell standing for 0. For example, 4 would be 4 dots, 5 would be 1 bar, 10 would be 2 bars, and 13 would be 2 bars and 3 dots. Or 13 would be 2 bars and 3 dots. Ah, interesting. 19 months, 18 months of total days, and a closing day of 5 months. Wayeb. Oh, wait. Maybe that's what I was thinking. 18. No. Trying to figure out the 52. How did I figure out the 52? 360. Maybe it was something as simple as 52 years divided by 360. And let's see. How about 52 years divided by 365? I can't figure it out. What was it? I calculated it before, and it was odd, because if it was based off of 360 days of the 360 times 20, maybe that's what it was. 360 times 20. What's 360 times 365 times? Oh no! Clear it out! Clear! All right, so 365 times 20. That doesn't make any sense. I'll figure it out. I'd like to get one of these things, or at least make them. Okay, so what am I? Now this is going into way more detail than I was expecting. Oh yeah, the animals or the symbols. There's a video about this. I wonder if that's the one with the Graham Hancock. I don't really know, but let's see. It's pretty interesting how a lot of it was symbolic. Oh, here's okay. So those extra 5 days were usually considered to be a special time. And I'm trying to find out more. I mean, just 1 month that just includes just those 5 weird days that they didn't like that particular month. It's just weird. Oh, here it is. The common denominators since 260 and 265. It will take 18,980 days. Approximately 52 years. Ah, I know what was going on. So rather than, so if it was 260 times 360, we divided it by 5. Crap. What am I doing? What am I doing? What's the 1890. Right. Did they do that right? You know, that's why people have to come on so I could figure this out. And do I have it silent? I might. Alright, let's keep going. I don't know what it was. It was just one of those times. That's why I need to keep better notes. Okay, so. Let's see. Then it goes into the Mexico, or the Aztecs. The name of the 52-year periods aren't known. Given a short month of 5 days, Wayeb at the end of the Hab, the first day of the following year has to be 5 days later in the Zolkin. Let's see. Gosh, why can't I figure this out again? Because what I was trying to do is calculate something like this, but if it was 360 days rather than 365 days, it wouldn't come out to 52 years exactly. It would be like 51 or 52 point whatever. It was something not whole. It wasn't a whole 52 years. And so they isn't that just interesting? If you think about it, that the calculations for the actual days of the revolutions around the orbit around the sun, it's not 360, and it's 365, and it has a whole number of 52 years, and we still use that today. Slightly different with the leap year, although yeah, interesting. I want to figure it out, but I don't want to waste people's time on this again. So, more about the Y up there. So the Mesoamerica, not just the Maya, but Aztecs and whatever. I don't know exactly why I was showing those. Now let's move on to Galileo Galilei. So, for people, the Gregorian calendar, it's named after Pope Gregory the 13th, who introduced it in October 1582, right? And they basically wanted to line it up with the solstice and Easter, because of the drift of the calendar with respect to the equinoxes from the Julian calendar, which was just 365.25, not 365.2425. So change it. So this is in 1582. Keep that in mind, because in that time period, that was before Galileo, which I don't think he would mess up the calendar at all. I mean, it's just the idea that rather than the sun orbiting the Earth, Galileo just introduced a little bit more information following Copernicus, that the Earth orbited the sun and the other planets orbited the sun. So, I mean, he was still under arrest at the time of his death on January 8th, 1642. So you would think that the Gregorian calendar might have been instituted after 1642, when he was still, Galileo was still in prison, but no, it was plenty of years before that time. So we're still going off of a calendar based on the Catholic Church, who like, no, the sun orbits the Earth, and yet we're still on that calendar today where they believe that. So it doesn't matter what any type of religion is believed, right? So we've got the Egyptians, which believed that the 5 extra days accounted for 5 deities being born. We've got the Maya calendar, where they added the 5 days, created an extra month out of a 18-month cycle, 18 months in a year. And those 5 days were just unlucky days. No one really knows why that they're unlucky. And then the Julian calendar, which they went from kind of a lunar calendar to the solar calendar, and they based off of the Egyptian calendar, but they added the 0.25 days in a year. And then Gregorian calendar, the Pope Gregory figured, okay, we're gonna line it up, so we're gonna just fudge a little bit of math, and the sun orbits the Earth, and anyone who says otherwise are gonna be under the arrest and put in prison until they die. And then finally today, we're still based off of that. So the myth doesn't really matter, but the days do. But look, that was still also before Johannes Kepler, the law of ellipses. They thought it was perfectly circular. I mean, why did this law come about at 1609? Shouldn't have that been found out centuries before? I mean, it took 1609 after the latest calendar, Gregorian calendar. Why don't we have a new calendar? Why are we still based off of a Gregorian calendar, which lines up, which is pretty still inaccurate, because they just want to line up a holiday, Easter, on a particular solstice. It's not exactly the full orbit around the sun. And of course, our time is still 24 hours, not based out of 23 hours and 57 minutes and 58 seconds, whatever it is. We keep adjusting for it and a lot of this other stuff. I mean, why don't we want to become more exact? Why do we keep fudging things? If we are a very scientific, very mathematical world or being, why do we keep lining things up in a mythological sense, or even religious sense, whatever it is? Yet I mean, it's just the the oddness. Look, if I knew if like a square, 490-degree angles, however many angles, whatever it is within the square, it's 360 degrees to make a complete square. I think I'm correct on that. Circle the same way. You do it, it's 360 degrees. Yet 360 days out of the year, full orbit, that would be the assumption, right? But for centuries, we knew that not to be the case. We measured it, whatever. And it's like, why do we have 365 days and not 360 days? Because a full circle of the degrees would be 360 exactly. So obviously, whatever's going on, it's not a perfect orbit. But no one thought of saying, hey, we don't have an elliptical orbit. But until 1609 AD, hey, we got an elliptical orbit. It's like, yeah, everyone knew. It's like, yeah, you might have known, but you guys kept coming up with stories. Anyways, that's just, I don't know. It's just weird. It's just weird when you think about it. I don't know if it's weird for any of y'all. I mean, those 5 extra days. Yeah. So all this time before that law of Johannes Kepler's 3 laws, it's like they would have said it's 365 days out of the year. I mean 360 days out of the year. They would keep saying that because hey, a full circle is 360 days, and therefore it's a perfect orbit. It's not an elliptical orbit. But they've known it was elliptical orbit regardless of the story, because 365 days, 365 degrees in a circle, it's just a little bit imperfect. It's elliptical, so it's not a circle. It's elliptical. They've known that for centuries, and it's weird. But it's kind of interesting if we talk about the history of Maya and the difference of that with the Egyptian. Because I wonder if the Maya, they've got 19 months, 18 months really, with 20 days. In 20 days, did they have the same thought of a day with hours? I mean, I think that's the only difference that I can see that no one's really gotten to, is that the Egyptian calendar is going to be based out of hours with Horus. 12 hours split in half to, of course, give or take. But did the Maya kind of think in that way? I would think so. It just has to be more research, I guess. But I mean, let's say we weren't influenced by any of these cultures, by the Maya or the Egyptians, and we create, or at least a solar calendar, and we created a calendar just based out of math. How would it look like? and basing our time out of that, how would we do that? Basing everything out of months or seasons or months or weeks and whatever. Interestingly enough, 52 weeks or in a year, and every 52 years is the full cycle of the Maya calendar. I don't think the Maya considered weeks. It's not divisible by 20 very well. So probably didn't think of weeks as at least 7 days in a week. I mean, 20 divided by 7 doesn't work. 13 divided by 7 doesn't work. 18 divided by 7 doesn't work. 19 divided by 7 doesn't work. They probably didn't think of weeks. Interesting. I don't know what to think anymore. This is just I'm at that impasse. Okay, where did those 5 extra days come from? And yet, for however many centuries, almost 5 centuries, 4,720 years, we knew the Earth had an elliptical orbit around the sun, and no one within those centuries, with all their mathematical prowess and their knowledge and whatnot, didn't come up with a law like Johannes Kepler. I guess it wasn't important for anyone for the last couple of centuries. I mean, they figured, hey, that's just common knowledge, I guess. That is, it's not. And so, my back. Now, how do we account for those the elliptical orbits? And we base it off of, like, pretty much, would it be gravitational? I mean, there's a lot of give and take and pull from other entities within the solar system, and I doubt it's exact every year. There's probably a give or take of, I wonder if there's acceleration or deceleration or anything like that. I mean, everything's in constant motion. I mean, we're just basing our time and our calendar from our Earth's orbit around the sun, and not anything outside of that or within the galaxy. And I don't know what to say, fellas. I mean, anyone else really thinking? I mean, coming up with where those extra 5 days came from, and I mean, what's interesting is it said that the Maya didn't come up with the calendar. Like it says, the Maya calendar dates back to at least the 5th century BCE and is still in use in some Mayan communities today. However, even though the Mayans contributed to the further development of the calendar, they did not actually invent it. So who invented it? And same thing with the Egyptian calendar. Did they invent that, or was it invented before and they just took it up and said, "Hey, like they couldn't have based it exactly out of the Maya calendar because they wouldn't have." They use different types of mathematics and explanations for it, but still, it's interesting the way that they're all broken up, and I think a lot of it has to do with the seasons, and because agriculture was part of the big thing. I mean, if you can figure out the best time to plant something, you're going to miss that time frame and you're going to ruin your growing season. So the importance of a calendar was great. I'm kind of speechless at this point. And anyone out there to help me, that would be great. I guess you guys are speechless too, or just don't care. It's like, whatever. It's calendar. I want my holidays. I want more holidays in a year. Nothing else matters. All right. So I'm sorry. There's really no. I have no answers. I just have questions. And so I'll probably do another one of these things later down the line when I figure out more stuff, figure out more information. I just thought some of those videos were interesting, how that there was the fire in the library in Germany, and the only book that someone thought of saving was the codex for the Mayan book, right? Just to understand the translating what the Maya had. I felt that was the most important thing out of the entire library, to get that. It's so weird. It's coincidental, maybe? I mean, he's like, hey, I just want to save one book in that library. Is this one? Or is it just, it was purposeful? Maybe, I mean, it was just like, I haven't solved it. but it's probably got some important stuff. But I only had time to save one book, so the fire must have been going pretty good. I mean, if I went into a burning building and could save one book, I'd be like, why not save a handful? It's like, oh, I gotta find that one book, take it. It's like, why not pick like a handful of books and just run out? It's like, why one book? See, things, the way that history is told just does not make sense. And a lot of people in history, that their thoughts, their thought processes, their logic, etc., I mean, might make sense to them in their religious way or their controlling way, whatever power structure it is. It makes sense. But in the actual logical sense, it really, maybe it was logic to them. Maybe we just have a difference of logic throughout history. I don't know. And why is it that we always don't know? I mean, does someone out there know? Maybe we're in this problem because no one knows. It's like, hey, let's keep this a secret from everybody else, but only certain people can know it. And then something happens to those certain people. It's like, so we lost all this information. And now, like, we're screwed. So who had the combination to this unbreakable lock? Oh, that was Sam. So what happened to Sam? Oh, Sam's dead. So who else did Sam tell? Oh, so Sam didn't tell anyone because it was just up to Sam. Oh, wait. Actually, Sam knew Fred. Fred was supposed to be the backup. So where's Fred? Oh, Fred's dead. So we're screwing ourselves because we want to hide all this information from each other just to get an upper hand, to make more money, when money can be printed whenever at the whim of whoever. Really, it doesn't make sense, because why would you care about, if you're in control of the world and you have all this money you can make up at any time, you have all this power, you're like the power that controls deep state, the religions, the Vatican, the Israel, US, the military, etc., all of that, and you really want to hide all this information from people, so those people don't have the information to be as powerful or make money or something. It doesn't make sense. It's like it has to be something more than that. I mean, that's just a lot of work. It's like, yeah, I'd be if I was like the trillionaire in this world with, I can manipulate anything. Like, why do I care what people know about history, the real history and whatnot? It's like, is it to make sure people don't revolt or find ways to be the next trillionaire besides me? It's like, I mean, I'm not going to be alive for much longer. What does it matter to me? Do I really care about my family? It's like, my family's dumb or something. I'm not talking about my family. I'm talking about their family. Whoever's the trillionaire or whatever behind family. I think every family has their I don't know, they don't think the same. I mean, just like people who say that they're woke and different and they see the problems. Family doesn't follow along. Family members are like everybody else. You rarely see like a brother and sister, two brothers, two sisters, a mother and father, or husband, wife, maybe a husband and wife, because they're from different families. But father and son, father and daughter, or mother and son, mother and daughter, or whatever, saying, hey, yeah, we're woke. We figured all this out. They're always different. They're always like, hey, we got to follow the Republicans or the conservatives. They understand what's going on. It's like the woke person says, no, it doesn't matter. They're both the same. And you got like the daughter saying, no, we need the SJWs and the Democrats and whatever. No, it doesn't matter. They're always kind of going their own way. And you would think that the 50% genetic material would kind of constitute a little bit more sameness than people who are absolutely not sharing the genetic material as closely, right? I mean, say me and my brother, we would probably share the same ideas of this stuff, but we probably don't at all. Yet someone like me and someone like some of the other people in that I kind of look into their research and stuff like that, we agree more so than even me, my brother, me, my father, me, my brother, whatever. Same thing with you. If you're kind of following the lines as I am, we're very, very vastly different genetically, yet we shouldn't be kind of thinking along the same lines. So why is that difference? What is it that we're doing that's different than everyone else? What are we drinking? What are we eating? I mean, families typically, if you're living in the same house, you're going to be eating and drinking the same thing. So it's not like we're oh, I'm eating and drinking this aside, same water, same food, same locations, same area. I mean, all those external influences are the same within a genetic population within that household. So most of the people in the family should be thinking more alike than they are, but they're not. So I would think that there's these powers that be that have families. It's like they just have to. Why would they have families? It's not for love. It's probably for. I mean, if you don't love them, why pass all this knowledge? It has to go somewhere. Maybe that has to do more with these orders, these cults, because they realize that all this knowledge isn't going to be the same throughout their lineage. Or maybe that lineage is slightly different. And I know I'm coming out on a very big tangent here. I mean, just think of the, I think there's a Saudi royal, a prince or something back in a couple of years ago. He defected from that family. It's like, what that family is doing is wrong. It's like, well, he ain't getting none of that inheritance money. But maybe he wasn't anyway. Maybe that's why he left. Or maybe he had to do something in order to obtain that. But you also see a lot of documentaries of very, very wealthy kids and how different they are from their parents. Because the parents, in order to make their wealth, they go through a lot of things. They probably make a lot of sacrifices. They probably join a lot of cults and organizations and whatever. And they're probably away from their kids all the time, and their kids are growing up expecting the millions or billions that their parents had. And it's like the parents are like, hey, you ain't getting any of this stuff. You're pretty much worthless. All you do is party all day and sleep and play games. Like, you're just gonna lose all this money. I ain't gonna give any of this to you. And you got the kids going, oh, yeah. I mean, you would think that those parents would invest a lot of their time into making sure that their offspring can handle the inheritance. But that doesn't seem to be the case. So there's that. And I mean, so within generations of family, there are so many differences, so much division. Yet for all these centuries, we stick to systems of control with calendars, astronomy, astrology has lasted for a long, long time. A lot of the occult stuff. I mean, look, join any club, and you're gonna actually have people close to it first. You're gonna have friends, family, etc. It's like, hey, I'm creating a club. You guys are the people I know best. How about you guys join it? And the way that club succeeds is you got different people all over joining it and saying, I agree with this ideology or the principles within this organization. And that's how it thrives. Isn't that just a weird thing that genetically different people from all over kind of agree on those aspects and not the people who are closest to you, especially family and location. And when it's just weird. And same thing with that experiment in one of the videos earlier. How they're just kind of measuring the heartbeat and the pictures, and they would press the button, and then 6 seconds later an image would pop up. Yet the heart started beating slightly differently than the others after what, something like 2,200 trials or 26 participants. They've had a feeling that something was going to be showing before they were actually seeing it. And that's about intuition. That's another interesting thing. So those extra 5 days, where did they come from? It doesn't matter. Does any of this matter? Do we even care? Do you even care? Do I even care? I mean, obviously I do, because I'm looking into it. It's like, okay. I mean, most of y'all aren't Roman Catholic. Most of y'all don't care about Easter and what it represents. Yet you guys are following a calendar based on a pope from the 1500s. It's not mathematical in nature, yet you're following along. Scientists out there are like, yeah, it's not because it's 5 deities, it's not because it's 5 unlucky numbers, it's because of the actual orbit. And then you realize that, hey, it's not 365.2425 days in order to make a full orbit around the sun. Whatever. It's not mathematically accurate, so we'll keep going. But do you think that way in any type of or form of science? No. Like, hey, this thing is off by 0.01%. We have a problem here. And yeah, if it's 0.01% off or whatever from a calendar, it's like, yeah, whatever. It's just a calendar. Who cares about the date and time? I guess I had a lot to say about nothing. Just thinking, I guess. I mean, let's see. An hour, 24 minutes, 25 minutes. You know what? I kind of want to just show the... I've got nothing else to say here. Graham Hancock, the evidence mainstream archaeology does not want you to see. I think it might dive into some of the different civilizations in the past. I think what I like about Graham Hancock, he's actually going around different places around the world and researching and just looking at all the technology or trying to figure out the technology that was used in the ancients. And it's like, how did the people back then with their technology, or the latest age that they were in the Copper Age? They didn't even have iron or steel or anything like that, yet they can move. It's like 1,900 ton blocks or something like that, or they could carve things exactly within these huge things and fit them all together. Or that within this day and age, with the technology and the machines that we have, we can't mimic exactly what the ancients built. Does that make you think a little bit? Anyway, let's play it. I'm too lazy to make a whole new show, and this might actually fit in a little bit with this. Not necessarily where the 5 extra days came from, not necessarily Maya, maybe Maya, not necessarily Galileo and the Catholic Church, but here we go. Enjoy.
When you're shopping for electronics, Nebraska Furniture Mart has it all. Shop thousands of electronics.
So we will start with the Ice Age. The last Ice Age set in around 125,000 years ago. It was pretty intense. It built up these giant ice caps on top of North America and Northern Europe. The ice was 2 miles deep. Sea level was much lower then than it is today, because what had happened, the world was freezing cold, rain fell, and the rain didn't go into the oceans. It froze as ice on the ice caps, and it built up and it built up and it built up. And the result of that was that sea level was 400 feet lower than it is today. So, you know, the world looks different. I mean, we have this huge Southeast Asian continent. Australia is joined to New Guinea. There's no Red Sea. There's no Persian Gulf. It's a very different world. Actually, the equivalent of Europe and China added together were above water then and are underwater now, since those ice caps melted. So the last glacial maximum was 21,300 years ago. This is North America at that time, and you can see that there are two principal ice sheets, the Cordilleran ice sheet in the west and the huge Laurentide ice sheet dominating the eastern sector of the continent. Around 30,000 years ago, a corridor opened up between the Cordilleran and the Laurentide ice sheet. There had been some warming. The world was kind of gently warming up at that time, and this ice-free corridor opened up. And for a long time, it was a very long time, until very recently, it was the view that there were no human beings in the Americas until that ice corridor opened up. 13,000 or 13,500 years ago, then it opens up, and then tribes sweep in across the Bering Land Bridge, because there was no Bering Strait at that time. The sea level was lower. Siberia was joined to North America, to Alaska. So tribes sweep in, and they come down through that ice-free corridor, and they spread out across North America. And this starts about just more than 13,000 years ago, and by 12,800 years ago, they've wiped out all the megafauna in North America. This has been the mainstream theory. It's called the overkill hypothesis, as to why there was a mass die-off of megafauna around about 12,800 down to 12,500 years ago. I myself have never found that hypothesis persuasive. I don't find it persuasive because I'm not subscribing to the myth of the noble savage, but I have encountered hunter-gatherers often in my research and in my work, and hunter-gatherers are not people who exterminate animals. They live in harmony with animals. They take the animals they need, but they don't overkill and leave huge numbers of corpses lying around. They're functioning with nature, not against nature. And I think this overkill hypothesis actually is a projection of our shadow side onto the past. We are the kind of culture that exterminates creatures. We are the kind of culture that is responsible for extinctions. And we're saying, yeah, everybody else was like that in the past as well. I don't think so. So this was called the Clovis first model. The so-called Clovis people are named because the type site, archaeologists like a site which typifies a culture, the type site is at Blackwater Draw near Clovis, New Mexico. So the people who made and they are known for making these really wonderful fluted points. It's a very distinctive style of weaponry. They're called the Clovis culture, and it is they who are attributed with the destruction of all the megafauna in North America. And that argument could be made for quite a long time, because there didn't seem to be any evidence of any human beings in America before the Clovis culture. But here's the thing, there was evidence. There was always evidence of earlier human settlement in the Americas, but it went against the prevailing archaeological paradigm. And actually in archaeology, when you go against the paradigm, you don't get research funding. You don't make a career. You get your career ruined, as a matter of fact. So archaeologists were very timid to come forward with evidence of earlier human populations in the Americas. And this Clovis first paradigm held a kind of death grip on archaeology for more than 50 years, absolutely inhibiting and preventing research into other possibilities about the peopling of the Americas. But really, since about 2007, it has started to unravel. Paradigms fall apart when you have an overwhelming accumulation of new evidence that the paradigm cannot explain. Paradigms can hold on sometimes for centuries. I mean, the Ptolemaic model of the solar system whereby the sun orbited the Earth, I mean, that actually maintained itself for a very, very, very long period of time. In the face of contrary evidence, they kept tweaking it to try to explain the contrary evidence. Eventually, it was overwhelmed, and we know that the Earth goes around the sun. Same with Clovis first. It was the predominant hypothesis in the latter half of the 20th century because there was no solid evidence of pre-Clovis habitation. Subtext, because any evidence of pre-Clovis habitation was brushed under the carpet and not accepted, and those who found it were ridiculed. But now it's become clear the evidence is overwhelming of much earlier sites than Clovis, and there's new genetic evidence which is also raising this question. So it was interesting to see the Smithsonian magazine very recently in March publish this kind of apology, really, and I'm glad they did publish it because they're referring to a Canadian archaeologist called Jacques Cinq-Mars. And Jacques Cinq-Mars, from the 1970s, was excavating a place called the Bluefish Caves in the Yukon. And he found evidence of human presence 24,000 years ago. That is...
We're here for the ones who plan and the ones who don't. The ones who love that next big thing and the ones who love to cook. We're here to help the place you live become the place you love. We're Nebraska Furniture Mart.
Well, more than 11,000 years before humans were supposed to be there. Was his discovery welcomed? Not at all. He was crushed by his colleagues. He was ridiculed, he was humiliated, he was accused of making stuff up, and his research funding was entirely withdrawn. And the Smithsonian are quoting Nature, rather than launching a major new search for more early evidence, the find stirred fierce opposition and a bitter debate, one of the most acrimonious and unfruitful in all science, noted the journal Nature. This is important because actually this acrimony in science is again and again preventing us from exploring new horizons, for considering what possibilities might be. It's somehow an outrage to consider possibilities. That's exactly what we need to do. We can't shut down inquiry in all sorts of areas because a group of academics have a vested interest in a particular model. And here, thank you. Here is, again, the Smithsonian are admitting it. It was, for Jacques Cinq-Mars, it was a brutal experience, something that Cinq-Mars once likened to the Spanish Inquisition. At conferences, audiences paid little heed to his presentations, giving short shrift to the evidence. Other researchers listened politely, then questioned his competence. And his fieldwork eventually sputtered and died. He couldn't get it. But the thing was, he was right. He was right. And the truth will come out. And today, decades later, the Clovis first model has collapsed. And, you know, you can read it for yourselves. The Clovis people, we know that pre-Clovis people were all over the Americas, and the latest evidence has confirmed Jacques Cinq-Mars in Bluefish Caves. Yes, humans were present in the Yukon 24,000 years ago. And now, the latest breaking news, Nature, 26th of April, 2017, 115,000 years earlier than thought, 115,000 years before Clovis, 130,000 years ago, predictably, this discovery is causing a storm of controversy. And the usual suspects are out saying, no, it isn't real, no, they're making it all up, no, those mastodon bones were smashed by a modern bulldozer, etc., anything to quibble the evidence away, rather than explore. Rather than actually get to grips with this and explore what it might mean, because my goodness, humans in America 130,000 years ago overturns everything. What kind of humans were they? Were they even anatomically modern humans like us, or were they Neanderthals? Were they Denisovans? Another human species that's recently been identified genetically. You know, we should have curiosity and open mind. We should welcome discoveries like this. We should jump on it and get in there and find out, instead of saying, nah, we don't believe it, we don't want to hear, and stuffing our ears with our fingers and waving down all opposition. Here's another scientific rebel who turned out to be right. I spoke about him in my book, Magicians of the Gods. His name is Harlan Bretz. And again, just recently, a major publication of the establishment Archaeology has come out with a huge apology to J. Harlan Bretz. This also happened in March in National Geographic. J. Harlan Bretz walked the walk across the channeled scablands of the Pacific Northwest for decades. He was an amazing field geologist. He actually began his research in the scablands in 1909 when he was still a high school science teacher. He was intrigued by these extraordinary potholes in the Quincy Basin. And it inspired him to take a degree in geology. And he went to the University of Chicago, and he was awarded his PhD prior to continuing his studies in the scablands. 1922, he's a tenured PhD geologist at the University of Chicago, and he returns to Eastern Washington, and he's really investigating what caused this spectacular damage on the landscape, what happened here. And after a huge amount of dedicated field research, I mean, really detailed, the thousands of kilometers this man walked, he comes up with the conclusion that there's only one possible explanation, that we are looking at the evidence of a giant, giant flood, something that was perhaps the largest flood that ever occurred on Earth. The only possible explanation for all the region's features was a massive flood, perhaps the largest in Earth's history, a debacle which swept the Columbia Plateau, ripping soil from the landscape, carving canyons and cataracts in a matter of days. Quote, all other hypotheses meet fatal objections, Bretz wrote in a 1923 paper. What? Please, go ahead. Interrupt me at any time. I'm eminently interruptible.
I guess there's a white Toyota being towed, BVE8251. They want us to say that.
About what?
A white Toyota being towed outside.
Fortunately, I'm not in a Toyota.
Yeah, luckily for you. White Toyota, is this working? White Toyota is being... White Toyota.
A white Toyota is being towed.
BVE8251.
Anybody have a white Toyota? Where is it? Okay, well. Okay, well, due diligence has been done. If anyone has a white Toyota, now would be the moment to rescue it.
BVC8251. Thank you.
Okay, so by proposing a single gigantic flood ripping up the scablands, Bretz was committing geological heresy. This was, after all, the 1920s. Geology was trying to separate itself from mistakes of the 19th century. It wanted to be more Catholic than the Pope. It wanted to be super scientific. And anything that sounded like superstition, see, what Bretz was talking about, it sounded like the flood of Noah. And this was just horror to the geologists of the time. They could not plunge back into biblical superstition. So Bretz was absolutely marginalized, and he came under enormous attack, and everything he said was rubbished, and his career was put on hold. This describes one event where he gave a public lecture about the gigantic flood, and the geologists were aghast in the same way that a room full of physicists would be upon hearing a colleague.
This is me. Look out, 'cause here I come, and I'm marching on to the beat I drum. I'm not scared to be seen. I make no apologies. This is me. We are bursting through the barricade.
Employee ownership. It means the people make all the difference, and that the customer is always first and always right. It means incredible deals, the freshest produce, the highest quality meat, and sustainable seafood. It means being so much more than just meat and grocery. Because today you need more. We are Hy-Vee, and this is me.
Explained how he had made a perpetual motion machine out of old popsicle sticks. Physicists had all learned very early of the futility of perpetual motion machines, and no properly educated geologist was supposed to traffic in catastrophes of any sort. And yet here's Brett's trafficking in catastrophes, trafficking in the single largest flood ever experienced on Earth. And it particularly outraged the dull minds at the Geological Society of America. They were very angry by this, and they went out and they looked at the stuff and they said, no, Brett's is completely wrong, and then they ambushed him at the Cosmos Club, where he'd been invited to give a talk in Washington, D.C., and he was ambushed by these gentlemen, amongst others. Giluli, for example, dismisses the notion of a single cataclysmic flood with words like preposterous, incompetent, and wholly inadequate. Mansfield a bit politer, but he just doesn't see at all that this could be a single flood. He'd rather see it be just the work of water over thousands and thousands of years. Meisner, before a theory that requires a seemingly impossible quantity of water is fully accepted, every effort should be made to account for the existing features without employing so violent an assumption. I believe the existing features can be explained by assuming normal stream work of the ancient Columbia River. And this became the dominant response to Brett's, and Brett's became a pariah, an absolute pariah in the geological community. He never, ever backed down, not for a second. His view was, they said to him, what's the source of all the water that caused the flooding? Brett said, not my problem, actually. I am just showing you the evidence of the flooding on the ground. It is indisputable, but they wanted the source. So for all of these reasons, he was marginalized. But come the 1950s, geology began to catch up with Brett's and began to recognize that he'd been right to claim that the damage to the Channel Scablands had been caused by cataclysmic flooding. Plaudits gradually began to come through. 1965, the International Union of Quaternary Research organizes an extensive field trip. They travel through the Quincy Basin, the Channel Scablands, and afterwards participants sent Brett's a telegram acknowledging his early insights and claiming, we are all catastrophists now. So Brett's receives that telegram and he replies, be assured that after 30 years and 30 papers in self-defense and more than 30 people who vigorously denied my theory, it did my heart good, like medicine. Then, at the age of 96, they give him the Penrose Medal. This is the ultimate accolade of geology. Brett's 96 years old, he says, all my enemies are dead, so I have no one to gloat over. And you go to Dry Falls, which is one of the fantastic landscape features of this flooding, and you'll see a plaque to J. Harlan Bretts, who patiently taught us that catastrophic floods may sometimes play a role in nature's unfolding drama. So was Bretts vindicated by this? It's more complicated than that. What brought about his transformation from pariah to poster boy? Well, the problem all along had been his insistence of flood without being able to nominate a source of the flood waters. That had been the problem. It challenged the ruling gradualist paradigm. And it held this work up for a very long time. But then came a solution that was proposed. And that is now the mainstream view. And it's a mainstream view that I and my colleague Randall Carlson oppose today. But the mainstream view now, and the solution that was proposed, is that there was indeed flooding. And it came out of this. It came out of glacial Lake Missoula, a lake created by an ice dam that blocked the Clark Fork River. Okay, so this is glacial Lake Missoula, and the theory is that the water builds up behind the ice dam. It actually gets to be 4,000 feet deep. There isn't a dam in the world that's impounding water more than 400 feet deep. 4,000 feet deep. And then it breaks the ice dam and the water spills out and begins to create the damage. But one flood wouldn't do it, not from the tiny catchment area of glacial Lake Missoula. They need more floods. And by the time of his last published paper in 1969, because it provided a source for the water, but always reluctantly, Bretts was willing to allow that there might have been as many as 7 or 8 floods. he didn't know that when you let the vampire of gradualism in the door, he expands his terrain. And now mainstream academia is saying, oh, there were 80 floods over 2,500 years. So that's one flood approximately every 31 years. That's not a cataclysm, that's gradualism. That's turning Bretz's cataclysm into a gradual series of events that actually fit the prevailing model. And National Geographic and other publications are willing to go into this. They publish maps showing glacial Lake Missoula and the channeled scablands. And they show some of the damage that Bretz was citing as evidence, and they say it can all now be explained by glacial Lake Missoula. This is an underfit waterfall in the Palouse Falls. You can see how huge it was during the Ice Age. But there's some of the landscape features that Bretz was originally convinced of being created by a single massive flood. They've always been difficult to account for by the multiple floods from Lake Missoula model. And one of them is this place, which is called Dry Falls in Washington State. It's really an enormous fossilized waterfall. You can see two lobes of it here and then another lobe over there. It's all of this, actually. That's that whole waterfall. And what happens with waterfalls is that they cut the rock over which they're pouring, and they gradually cut it back and cut it back and cut it back. And it turns out that this enormous, now fossilized waterfall was created by unbelievable flows of water that rose and fell within just 3 weeks. If it had carried on long, it would have gone further up Grand Coulee. It just stopped dead in its tracks between Upper and Lower Grand Coulee. Now I'm here with Randall Carlson, and I want to pay absolute tribute to Randall, because Randall is, in my view, the modern J. Harlan Bretz. Randall is a self-taught geologist, but he knows more about geology than any PhD geologist I've ever met. And he has walked those landscapes just as Bretz did. So he took me on a trip, and we're now standing actually beneath one of the lobes of Dry Falls, looking at some maps on the front of our vehicle. And here we are overlooking Dry Falls from the viewpoint. If anybody hasn't been there and you get a chance to go to Dry Falls in Washington State, I strongly urge you to do so. In fact, the whole area is really rather remarkable. To give you a sense of how big Dry Falls is, let's put Niagara Falls in the picture. That's Niagara Falls, the work of 12,000 years of erosion by the river. In the case of this, we're looking at something that rose and fell incredibly rapidly. And what's coming across it, what's coming over it, isn't just water. Whole forests have been ripped up by their roots. There are enormous quantities of icebergs in this. This is coming off the ice cap. There are enormous quantities of icebergs jostling in the flow. There's mud and rubble at the bottom, so it's highly erosive, and as it pours through at very high speeds, it's cutting the ground away underneath it until it stops and leaves this fossil. Other examples, we all know what current ripples are. You go to a beach, tide goes out, and it leaves these little ripples, which are, you know, an inch, half an inch high. Nature is fractal. There are current ripples at the bottom of the Camas Prairie in Washington State. And those current ripples are not an inch high. Those current ripples, as you can see from the vehicle in this picture, those current ripples are 50 feet high and 300 feet long. They are enormous current ripples. Fractal, just the same as the current ripples on the beach, caused by the same thing, a current flowing out, but a giant current, something really huge, creating things on this enormous scale. And then we come to Wenatchee, and we see the first of many, many examples of what are called glacial erratics. This enormous boulder, sitting 500 feet above the valley floor at Wenatchee, doesn't belong there. It was brought from about 100 miles further north. What's it doing there? How did it get there? I'm in front of it with Randall Carlson here, to give you a sense of the scale of it, and there I'm on top of it. This enormous boulder is calculated to weigh 18,000 tons. How did it get there? It got there in an iceberg the size of an oil tanker, which grounded, carried on the flood, grounded against the valley side, stuck there. The flood receded, The iceberg was left, it melted away, and it exposed this giant boulder that it had entrained. Glaciers are constantly entraining huge amounts of rock. There it sits. And it's not alone. Go across the Channel Scablands and you will find thousands and thousands of these huge boulders, every one of them carried there in an iceberg. And the close positioning of these boulders, the very fact that they're all clustered together, like here in Boulder Park, the very fact that they're all clustered together tells us this all happened at once. This wasn't a series of events. This was one event that dropped them all there at one moment. A giant flood, truly, as Harlan Bretz had always said. And interestingly, the Willamette meteorite was carried down on those floodwaters as well. There's something, you know, we don't.
You've heard about the black card, right? No, not the one from Visa or American Express. This one is much more valuable. There are entire organizations that have been built upon it, and individuals that have used it to acquire both wealth and influence. If this sounds like something you might wish to own, you should know that there is only one way you can get your hands on it. You have to be born with black skin. That's the only requirement. Really. You can be poor, middle class, rich, it doesn't matter. The black card will still confer upon you an entire history of oppression, even if you've never been oppressed. Flash the black card and most white people will cower. Play the black card expertly and you can win awards, make millions, all the while claiming that the people who got you there somehow hate you. With a black card, you can sell books full of indecipherable prose, because with a card that powerful, who cares if your words make any sense? You can call yourself a civil rights leader and shake down multinational corporations, or you can torch your own neighborhood because you didn't like the outcome of a grand jury verdict. Ironically, the people you might think have the most legitimate claim to the black card refuse to use it. Take my grandfather, for instance. He raised me from the time I was 9 years old. Born in 1941 in rural North Carolina, he started working at age 5, laying out tobacco to dry on a sharecropping farm. Jim Crow, separate drinking fountains, and the KKK were ever-present realities. He was 17 when he married.
I don't fully understand going on here. So Bretz never really was happy with the multiple floods. He accepted it because it got the critics off his back, but to the end of his days, he said the unique assemblage of forms described as the Channel Scabland records a unique episode in Pleistocene history. Special causes seem clearly indicated. And this is where I have been speaking for some time now about the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. The proposal that 12,800 years ago, 4 fragments of a large comet, may not have been a comet, may have been an asteroid breaking up, we don't know absolutely yet. 4 fragments of a cosmic impactor hit the North American ice cap. It's a very compelling, thoroughly documented case. It's been made by a group of more than 60 eminent scientists. And I think if Bretz had had that case in front of him, that the North American ice cap was hit by fragments of rock coming in at 70,000 miles an hour, he would have realized that it supplied the shock and the heat and the kinetic energy to unleash precisely the flood that he identified all along. He would never have needed glacial Lake Missoula. Briefly on comets and asteroids and cosmic impacts in general, we all know that the dinosaurs were made extinct by a cosmic impact, and there's still arguments about whether it was a comet or an asteroid. It's often referred to as the KT event, or these days the Cretaceous Paleogene event. They keep changing the name. It happened about 65 million years ago. A large asteroid or comet fragment smacked into the Gulf of Mexico, created a global firestorm, a giant cataclysm, and in that cataclysm, sorry, knocked off my microphone. Am I still audible? A number of things became clear. There's a layer of soil in the earth. It's marked here with this dotted line, which is full of the chemical signatures of a giant impact, things that are created instantly in the massive heat and shock of an impact, including iridium, carbon microspherules, nanodiamonds, shocked quartz, melt glass that's similar to trinitite, you know, the glass that's made in nuclear explosions, and melted at huge temperatures across a wide area of the Earth's surface. This was the first evidence that it had been a cosmic impact that made the dinosaurs extinct. And interestingly, this is just the way science works. Interestingly, Lewis and Walter Alvarez, who put that proposal forward, spent 10 years having their reputations savaged by their colleagues, and were accused of all kinds of malfeasance and of dishonesty, as a matter of fact. But they were right. And when they found the crater, as they eventually did, it's the Chicxulub crater in the Gulf of Mexico, deeply buried now, but visible on remote scanning. When they found it, it ceased to be controversial, and today we fully understand that the dinosaurs were made extinct by a cosmic impact. Could have been a comet, could have been an asteroid. We're still working on that. But so this is why I'm showing you these pictures of dinosaurs and chickens, because that event was so enormous that it literally turned dinosaurs into chickens. I mean, go figure. You know, the birds are the last surviving line of the dinosaurs. And the dinosaurs were gone, but the chickens were left. And that was just as well, you know, for this little creature, this little shrew-like creature that was skulking in the primeval forests at that time, because that little shrew-like creature was the ancestor of the mammalian line. And 65 million years later, meet your 65-million-year-old mother. We are all descended from that shrew, painful though it may be to contemplate. And we would not be here if that asteroid or comet had not smacked into the Gulf of Mexico 65 million years ago, because the mammals were going nowhere in a world ruled by dinosaurs. You needed to get those big chickens out the way, you know, before the mammals could come into their own. So these are world-changing events. NASA wants to tell us that they're very rare. NASA tells us that events like that occur only once every 100 million years. How nice of the universe to be so Germanic in its timekeeping that we can actually set our cosmic clocks by it. But there are many scientists and astronomers who are uncomfortable with NASA's comforting position. And they include the late Sir Fred Hoyle, leading astrophysicist from Britain, Chandra Wickram Singh, Victor Klube, Bill Napier, and many others. They are arguing that actually there are fluxes of events, that and in geological time, these fluxes can unfold over 20 or 30,000 years, but when you view that in context of hundreds of millions of years, you don't even notice it. They've been warning that our cosmic environment may be much more active than NASA believes. They point out that there is no ancient culture in the world that regarded the appearance of a comet in the sky as good news. It was always regarded as bad news. And here's a NASA fact sheet where NASA is telling us what a meteor shower is. It's good to be aware of this. It's useful facts, actually. Whenever we see meteors on a beautiful, clear night, and I imagine they're very visible out here. Whenever we see meteors, we don't see them in cities because of light pollution. What we are seeing is the remnants of a comet. There are many meteor streams. Could be the Perseids, could be the Orionids, could be the Leonids, could be the Taurids. Every single meteor stream is the remnant of a fragmented comet, because that's what comets do. They break up into multiple fragments, and when those fragments are very small, they come into Earth's atmosphere, but they burn up. They don't even touch the Earth. And so NASA's telling us this in this fact sheet, and it's saying, but don't worry, the meteors are usually small, from dust particle to boulder size, almost always small enough to quickly burn up in our atmosphere, so there's little chance any of them will strike Earth's surface. But there's a good chance that you can see a beautiful shooting star show in the middle of the night. So nothing to worry about at all. in our cosmic environment. This is a comet. This is comet Shoemaker-Levy 9. You will still hear geologists say that comets are just icy snowballs, dirty snowballs. They're much more than that. The Philae lander recently landed on comet P67. That was no dirty snowball. That was a mass of solid rock. Okay? Comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 shows us, we actually got it in real time, what happens to comets when they approach a planet. And what happened to comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 as it approached Jupiter was that it broke up into more than 20 glowing fragments. And each of those fragments, one by one, like a freight train of disaster, hit Jupiter. And every single explosion was larger than the Earth itself. Which is the moment, I always say this, to say, thank you, Jupiter. Thank you for taking one for the team. Because Jupiter is the giant guardian of our planet. That huge gas giant out there in the outer solar system, it sweeps up most of the comets that would hit the Earth. It really is protecting us, Saturn too. But every now and then a comet gets through into the inner solar system. And here is Bill Napier. I'm not expecting you to read this fuzzy-looking paper on the screen, perhaps just the title, Paleolithic Extinctions and the Torrid Complex. Bill Napier is expressing what is really the dominant view amongst he and his astronomer colleagues, that round about 20,000 years ago, a very large comet, 100 kilometers in diameter, entered the inner solar system on an orbit that crosses the path of the Earth. And that comet is the progenitor of what is called the Torrid meteor stream, which we pass through twice a year, at the end of June and at the end of October into early November. The evidence, decades old now and not even controversial amongst the comet community, is that an exceptionally large, low-inclination, short-period comet has been orbiting in our neighborhood for about 20,000 years. In such a disintegrating environment, there is a reasonable probability of a catastrophic encounter with debris in the comet trail. And those catastrophic encounters have occurred, and the first one happened 12,800 years ago. That is the point he's making in this paper. He is linking it to the work of a whole team of other scientists, those who have looked at what is called the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, who have been arguing from geological basis that a comet hit the Earth 12,800 years ago. He's linking it up. He's putting all the astronomical data together with that, and he's saying this is the Torrid meteor stream, and this is what we have to be paying close attention to. It's called the Torrid meteor stream because it seems to emanate from the region of the sky that we see the constellation of Taurus in. Of course, it's not coming from light years away. It's in our immediate cosmic environment. End of June, the beta Taurids, we don't see them. They're coming in from the daylight side of the Earth. End of October, early November, we call them the Halloween fireworks. Everybody sees them. And we pass through this thing twice a year. The last significant impact out of the Torrid meteor stream was the famous Tunguska event. It happened on the 30th of June at the peak of the beta Taurids, 30th of June, 1908. It wasn't even big. It was no more than 60 to 190 meters in diameter. It actually exploded in the air. That airburst flattened 80 million trees across an area of more than 2,000 square kilometers. That area is the size of the city of Greater London. If this had happened over an inhabited area, over a city, we would be paying very close attention to the Torrid meteor stream today. But it happened over an uninhabited area, and trees were the principal casualties. And there's very little attention is paid to it as a result. So we intersect the Torrid meteor stream twice a year. We've been doing so for 20,000 years. And the evidence now is that some big objects fell out of the Torrid meteor stream 12,800 years ago, and I'll give you other examples of later impacts as well. But broadly speaking, while the astronomers have been looking up at the sky, the team of scientists behind the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis have been looking at the ground, and they've been making disturbing new discoveries. So this is the first paper that links the work of these two teams. It seems to be this is when they became aware of each other. The other team is led by James Kennett, who's a marine geologist, professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara, world-renowned expert in paleoceanography. Alan West, a geophysicist, Richard Firestone, staff scientist, Nuclear Science Division, Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory. James Whitker is a geologist. Albert Goodyear is an archaeologist. They are just some of the more than 60 members of the group that now call themselves the Comet Research Group, who have been behind all the work that's been published on the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis in the last decade. And it's important that we be aware of this work, and it's important that its critics not be allowed to minimize it and dismiss it. This is serious work which has been seriously undertaken. They have never had a penny of official funding. They are so dedicated, they feel the work is of such importance, they've funded entirely their research themselves. And they've been pretty successful in getting the information out into the public domain. So again, we revisit the Ice Age, 21,300 years ago, the last glacial maximum. After the last glacial maximum, temperatures rise actually quite steeply. Then they begin to drop, and then you get this sudden plunge in temperature 12,800 years ago. Right down to almost as cold as it was at the coldest of the Ice Age. That episode lasts for 1,200 years, from 12,800 to 11,600 years ago. And then, equally mysteriously, temperatures rocket up, shoot up. The Earth gets very warm. This is a mystery. Why did this happen? It's been known as the Younger Dryas by geologists for many decades. They know the temperature records. They know it happened, but it's not been explained. So this is the mystery that the team that I've just shown you set out to solve. At exactly that time, at exactly the Younger Dryas, 12,800 to 11,600 years ago, you get this incredible spike in megafaunal extinctions, particularly in North America, but actually all over the world. There's a huge die-off of large animals at that point. Limited regional explanations won't suffice. North America definitely stood at the epicenter of some kind of giant global cataclysm. It was worst of all here, but it was bad all over the world as a result of this. This was a global event. And again, the first evidence of it comes from a distinct layer in the soil, exactly as was the case with the dinosaur event. That's what's first found, a distinct layer in the soil. It contains a lot of soot from the burning, the burning of continent-wide burning of forests. There were huge fires were set off by this. And it contains all of the impact proxies that were found with the dinosaur event, the nanodiamonds, the carbon spherules, the melt grass, all of these impact proxies, the iridium, are found in that layer. And their first paper, again, I don't expect you to read it, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, 9th of October 2007, evidence for an extraterrestrial impact 12,900 years ago that contributed to the megafaunal extinctions and the Younger Dryas cooling. This was their first paper. Then they go on in 2009, shock-synthesized hexagonal diamonds in Younger Dryas boundary sediments. Here, a whole raft of papers. Very high temperature impact melt products, evidence for cosmic airbursts and impacts 12,900 years ago, evidence from central Mexico, evidence from the Greenland ice cores, evidence for deposition of 10 million tons of impact spherules across 4 continents 12,800 years ago. The team have revised their date down. They thought it was 12,900. They're now very convinced it was 12,800 years ago that the first events occurred. Journal of Geology, 2014, nanodiamond-rich layer across 3 continents consistent with major cosmic impact 12,800 years ago. This Bayesian chronological analysis is a statistical analysis of the impact sites, and they were trying to consider, could this proxy evidence have been laid down gradually over hundreds and hundreds of years? The Bayesian chronological analysis rules that out. This event unfolded in a single terrible day and night, 24 hours. It began and it devastated the world, and it left what is called a strewn field, a field of objects created by the impact right across the Earth's surface, 50 million square kilometers of the Earth's surface. It comes in from the northwest, it streaks across North America, it drops at least 4 fragments on the North American ice cap. It continues across the Atlantic Ocean. Other fragments hit the Northern European ice cap, and the furthest east they have evidence for impact is a site called Abu Huraira in Syria, very close actually to the site of Göbekli Tepe. Of course, You don't go proposing that a comet hit the Earth and changed everything. If their hypothesis is accepted, not just one paradigm is going to fall. Many paradigms are going to fall. You can't pontificate about history and not take into account a world-changing global event right at the time when origins of civilization are supposed to begin. A lot is going to have to change. So this hypothesis has received an enormous amount of criticism. And I am publishing, I'm putting up on the screen here, some of the papers that have been written attempting to refute the hypothesis. They're very arrogant, they're very high-handed. One of them in 2011 is called a requiem for the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. A lot of people who don't like the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis cite that requiem paper as though it was never refuted. That requiem paper has been completely and comprehensively refuted. There isn't a single word of truth in it. It's absolute rubbish. But you don't hear about the refutations, you only hear about the papers that put the impact hypothesis down. My colleague Robert Schoch is amongst those who doesn't accept the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. He has stated that on his website. The Comet Research Group have replied to him. They've given a detailed response to his criticisms, and I don't know what the outcome of that is going to be. And of course, I'm just giving you a few examples of the papers published in refutation of the refutations. This is how it is in academia. You say stuff, people attack you, you attack them back. Eventually, somehow you hope the truth will emerge. The latest paper. Well, first of all, this one on the left is from the 6th of October, 2013. Large platinum anomaly in the Greenland ice core points to a cataclysm at the onset of the Younger Dryas. Nature Scientific Reports published this March, just a month ago, widespread platinum anomaly documented at the Younger Dryas onset in North American sedimentary sequence. This is dynamite. This paper, I mean, I know it doesn't look like dynamite, but take my word for it, this is dynamite. Platinum in that abundance, found in a very clearly dated layer to 12,800 years ago, can only come from an extraterrestrial source. It does not come from a terrestrial source. Platinum is very rare in the Earth's crust, but is common in asteroids or comets. This is the paper, I believe, that is going to turn the corner in this debate. And it's published in the most prestigious scientific reports of Nature magazine. So it's a very, very serious contribution to the debate. I don't see how anybody can turn around and say, nah, the impact proxies don't add up to an impact, show us the crater, when this is there. When we have this platinum layer across North America. And by the way, the crater is not easy to find because the primary impacts were on 2-mile deep ice. The craters were excavated in ice. The ice then melted away. Here's another paper, also published in March. It's a model for the geomorphology of the Carolina Bays, and it's published in the journal Geomorphology. The Carolina Bays, these elliptical depressions, in North and South Carolina, and these ellipses, by the way, can be 1 kilometer long and half a kilometer wide. They've long looked like they were caused by some sort of impact. It looks like a scatter of rubble came in and hit the Earth. There's 500,000 of these things in the Carolinas. But when you get down and examine them, there's no evidence of any extraterrestrial material in the Carolina Bays. And the dating sequence is all mixed up. Some of the soil seems to be turned over, so it's been hard to pin it to a particular date or a particular event until the publication of this paper by Zamora. There's a Carolina Bay, by the way. I'll give you a sense of these things. So here's the thing with the Carolina Bays, okay? They all line up northeast to southwest. Sorry, northwest to southeast. Northwest to southeast. Except you may notice down in the right-hand corner here, there's something else. That's the Nebraska rainwater basins. Long way from the Carolina Bays, and they are oriented northwest to southeast in the opposite. So this is, sorry, I keep getting my geography mixed up. Carolina Bays are oriented northwest to southeast. The Nebraska rainwater basins are oriented northwest to south, sorry, northeast to southwest. I'm dyslexic in this sense, you know, I do this when I'm writing as well. I mix up north and south, and I know what I mean, but I don't say it clearly. Anyway, you get the point. Carolina bays are oriented this way, Nebraska basins are oriented that way, all right? And here's a satellite image of the Nebraska basins. That's what it looks like when you look at the countryside, but a LiDAR image will show you these huge elliptical depressions in Nebraska. And this is the explanation that Zamora is putting forward, that an impact in the Great Lakes, specifically on Saginaw Bay in Michigan, one of those 4 impacts out of the Younger Dryas impactor, caused a massive ejection of ice out of the ice cap. And that ice went up into almost suborbital heights, and then it came down again, ejecta. It came down, and it came down, of course, everywhere, but it came down on 2 areas of soft soil where it left traces, one in Nebraska and one over here in the Carolinas. Nebraska and the Carolinas. In other areas where it fell on hard rock, the ice shattered and it didn't leave a trace. But in these areas, the soil was perfect to record a trace of these impacts of these ice boulders. This is terrestrial material that is impacting the Earth. It's ejecta. It isn't extraterrestrial material. It's been thrown out by the impact of the extraterrestrial material. And actually, Zamora did very good due diligence. He went to NASA Ames. He used their vertical gun. He simulated impacts on ice. And it produced exactly what he's arguing in this paper, that the Carolina bays and the Nebraska rainwater basins were both created by ice ejecta out of a primary impact in Saginaw Bay. And indeed, this is the suggestion, that this Saginaw Bay, in the mitten of Michigan, between the thumb and the mitten, that the Saginaw Bay is an impact crater, that the impactor came in through the ice, penetrated deep enough to etch this deep hole in the bottom of what is now Lake Superior, smashed up the ice top, threw that ice up into a huge blanket of ejecta, and in a couple of places where the soil was right, Nebraska and Carolina Bays, the fingerprints are still left in the soil. And again, everything has been done in this paper to require us to reconsider the Carolina bays and the Nebraska basins as part of the evidence in this case. The way that the bays are formed, the ellipses, the overturned flaps, it all proves out on the simulations. Now, the importance of the Carolina bays is the following, that I'm going to read this. The comet itself had not killed the megafauna. The saturation bombardment by the ice boulders that were ejected when the comet struck the Laurentide ice sheet caused the extinction event. The landscape of the eastern seaboard had been transformed into a barren wasteland, full of huge, shallow mud holes. The Carolina bays have remained as evidence of the glacier ice impacts on the soft, sandy soil of the east coast. No such evidence remains of the ice chunks that must have fallen on harder ground, but the ice impacts in the central and midwestern states were equally merciless. When the colossal chunks of glacier ice hit the hard terrain, they shattered and sent out ice fragments at high speed. Any creature or vegetation in the path of the fast-moving ice shards was destroyed. When the ice finally came to rest, the ejecta blanket had covered 1/2 of the contiguous United States with a thick layer of crushed ice that increased the albedo of the Earth and reflected a significant portion of the dimmer light from the sun back into space. The combined effect of the increased ice cover and the orbiting ice crystals would make the land cold and inhospitable for many years. The buried vegetation would freeze or remain dormant under the ice. Grazing animals that had survived the glacier ice bombardment had no access to their normal food sources and would soon starve. Predators that were still alive would also soon die without their herbivorous prey. Eventually, North America would be repopulated by new land animals and new humans. But the megafauna and the ingenious Clovis people that had crafted such fine stone projectiles were gone forever. The critics keep saying, where's the crater? The research is going on for craters right now. Actually, we managed to raise not a lot by research standards, but I did put out an appeal for crowdfunding, and we raised about $35,000 for these guys. And their first target is to investigate the Corosol crater, the Bloody Creek structure, and the Charity Shoal feature. All of these are potential impact craters just beyond the edge of the former ice sheet. And again, the early evidence is that they're dating exactly to 12,800 years ago. And of course, there's evidence all across North America, St. Croix River in Minnesota, Finger Lakes of New York State, all of these, I and Randall and others who are now working on this are taking as evidence of a huge unleashing of water from the North American ice cap 12,800 years ago. And interesting that amongst the objects carried down in the flood is this iron meteorite. Is it part of the original impactor? It's increasingly obvious, at least to me, that the scientists of the Comet Research Group are onto something really important. I think the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is going to be vindicated. And in summary, 12,800 years ago, multiple fragments of a giant comet impacted the Earth. At least 4 of the fragments were in the range of 2 kilometers in diameter. Impacts were concentrated on the North American ice cap, but the resulting climate disaster was worldwide. Why did the world get so cold? The explanation, and this is fully accepted, is that there was a massive unleash of melting water. It interrupted the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream is part of the global meridional overturning circulation of our planet. The central heating system of our planet was effectively switched off for 1,200 years. That's why the Earth got so cold. The floodwaters didn't just go down into the lands of North America, but they went into the world ocean as well, and they interrupted the thermohaline circulation. Why did it get so warm so suddenly at the end of the Younger Dryas? The science on this is much less advanced than the science on the beginning of the Younger Dryas. I was intrigued researching this to find that Sir Fred Hoyle, professor of astronomy at Cambridge University, had been interested by the Younger Dryas way back in the 70s, and in the early 80s, he addressed himself specifically to the sudden temperature rise at the end of the Younger Dryas. At that time, there was no Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. But presciently, he said that what would do it would be if there were impacts in an ocean. If you get big impacts in an ocean, it throws up a huge cloud of water vapor into the upper atmosphere, shuts down the sun's rays, and of course, initiates enormous flooding. So that there's the suggestion that 12,800 years ago, we get the first impacts out of the torrid meteor stream, and 11,600 years ago, we get further impacts out of the torrid meteor stream. Remember, the original object was 100 kilometers wide. And those further impacts are not on ice, they're in ocean, and they create a water vapor effect that causes global warming. But there's another explanation, which is also, I believe, a very significant one, and this is my colleague Robert Schoch. Robert addresses himself much more to the issue of 11,600 years ago than he does to the issue of 12,800 years ago. I have huge respect for Robert Schoch. He's a friend, and he's an ally, and he's done amazing work in this field. And what he's suggesting is that the sudden temperature increase 11,600 years ago may have been the result of extraordinary solar activity. Coronal mass ejections. And that, I think, must be thrown into the mix along with the comet. I'm very satisfied that the comet evidence is compelling for 12,800 years ago. But for 11,600 years ago, more work still needs to be done to explain that sudden temperature rise. So whatever the agency, what's sure now is that the Younger Dryas was a cataclysm, that it started 12,800 years ago, that it finished 11,600 years ago, and then global temperatures soared and the remaining ice caps very rapidly collapsed into the sea, causing a dramatic pulse of sea level rise, nominated by geologists as Meltwater Pulse 1b. Meltwater Pulse 1b, 11,600 years ago, just by coincidence, turns out to be the date that Plato gives for the destruction and submergence of the lost civilization of Atlantis. Plato is very specific about the date. Of course, archaeologists say that Plato made the whole thing up. He made it up to make some kind of moral or political point. That's the argument. So, as Plato tells us, Atlantis, what were its characteristics? It had advanced architecture, advanced agriculture, advanced navigational, shipbuilding and seagoing skills, advanced social and political organization. Plato tells us that it was formerly a really beautiful civilization, dedicated to the nurture of spirit, but then corruption entered in, and Atlantis became cruel, and it became arrogant, and it began to impose its power around the world, and it suffered from what the Greeks call hubris, an overweening self-pride. and in a ringing phrase, it ceased to carry its prosperity with moderation. And Plato is suggesting that the universe punished Atlantis with the flood. Now, how did Plato know about Atlantis at all? He knew about it through his family line, through his ancestor Solon, who had made a famous visit to Egypt around 600 BC, where Solon actually went around kind of interviewing priests like a modern journalist. And at the Temple of Sais in the Delta, Solon was told an extraordinary story. He was told the story of Atlantis. The priest said they had the records going back thousands and thousands of years of the destruction of this high civilization of Atlantis and its submergence beneath the sea. Such a serious event that after it, mankind was forced to begin again like children with no memory of what went before. And Plato, except the memory kept by the priests in their archives. And Plato said to the priests, so when did this happen? And they said 9,000 years ago. Well, do the math. 9,000 years ago in 600 BC is 9,600 BC. It's 11,600 years ago. It's, give or take a decade, it's exactly meltwater pulse 1b. So if Plato made the story of Atlantis up, it's really quite astonishing that he gives us a date that accords with the latest geological science on the cataclysm at the end of the Younger Dryas. So there's Plato's date for the destruction and submergence of Atlantis. And of course, Egyptologists will tell you that there is no mention of Atlantis in any ancient Egyptian text. Well, that's true. There isn't. You can't find the word Atlantis in any ancient Egyptian text. But can you find the story of a sacred island of the gods that was the home of an advanced culture, that was destroyed in a giant cataclysm that involved something coming from the sky, and that ended up with the sacred island of the gods being swallowed up by the sea? Yeah, absolutely. You can find that story in ancient Egypt. You can find it carved all over the walls of the temple of Horus at Edfu, for example. This temple is interesting. It's not that old. It's about 300 BC. It was actually put up about 300 years after Solon's visit. But like all temples in Egypt, it was built on the site of an earlier temple, which turns out to have been built on the site of an even earlier temple, which was built on the site of an even earlier temple, going back into the pre-dynastic period. And the priests of the temple of Edfu inherited the archives of those previous temples. And amongst them was a body of material falling apart, written on animal skins, which told the story of the destruction of the sacred island of the gods. And the priests of Edfu decided they were going to preserve that stuff. They were going to preserve extracts from it. And that's what they did. They carved them deeply into the walls of this new temple they were building. And they're called the Edfu building texts. And they're primarily found between the inner and outer enclosure walls. And this is what the Edfu building texts look like. And they speak of a homeland of the primeval ones that was destroyed in a great flood. And they tell how the primeval ones, the gods, came to Egypt and established religion by building primeval mounds up and down the land. In fact, it's made clear that those mounds originally set out by the primeval ones in the first time, in the time that the ancient Egyptians called Zep Tepi, the first time. That those mounds were indeed to be the sites of all future temples and pyramids that would be built in Egypt. They were a cosmic blueprint that was being placed on the earth at that time. And the texts describe a snake called the Great Leaping One, chief enemy of the god. And it's his assault that causes the homeland of the primeval ones to be swallowed up by the sea. So often comets are depicted as serpents or snakes in ancient literature. Swallowed up by the sea, but first the island was pierced and the domain was split. The Edfu texts make it clear that there were survivors of the destruction of the primeval island of the gods, that they settled in many parts of the world, that they wandered the world. And their project in wandering the world was to reincarnate or in some way restart the civilization that they had lost. And it was pursued not only in Egypt, but in many other lands. And this is why Göbekli Tepe, which other speakers will also be addressing, is of the greatest importance and interest. This site, Göbekli Tepe, in Turkey, in the region of Turkey called Anatolia. Because that same date, 11,600 years ago, is now the date that is being given by mainstream archaeology for the foundation of Göbekli Tepe. And Göbekli Tepe is a problem for archaeology because it is a giant megalithic site, completely out of place in time. 7,000 years older than Stonehenge. And what archaeologists say when you say, where's the background to this? Where did they learn to create this megalithic site? Well, what they say is this was a group of hunter-gatherers. Effectively, what they say is this was a group of hunter-gatherers who woke up one morning equipped with all the knowledge necessary to create what will turn out to be the largest megalithic site ever built on Earth. And oddly enough, agriculture suddenly blossoms around Göbekli Tepe just when Göbekli Tepe is made. Not only did they invent megalithic architecture, but also they invented agriculture, on the back of an envelope the next day. So there's the comparison. Göbekli Tepe, this is just a small part of Göbekli Tepe that's been excavated, and Stonehenge. We understand Stonehenge, an agricultural community in the Neolithic. It is generating surpluses. You can set aside resources so that you can have people who specialize as architects, people who specialize as astronomers, people who specialize in organizing the large labor force that you need in order to have a megalithic site. But you can understand that in an agricultural community. But the people of Göbekli Tepe were entirely hunter-gatherers before Göbekli Tepe was built. There's no evidence for anything else. Then suddenly it's built, and suddenly they're agriculturalists. It's the absence of background to Göbekli Tepe that is the problem. Here's another view, again, of the main area that's been excavated. These T-shaped megaliths, 11,600 years old. Here's one that was left in the quarry because it developed a fault. The scale is more than human. Many of the megaliths are carved. This is, of course, Pillar 43 in Enclosure D. Really a striking series of images there. I won't go into details on how I interpret those images at the moment. And here I am with Professor Dr. Klaus Schmidt, the excavator of Göbekli Tepe. This was in 2013 that Santa took this photograph. Unfortunately, Klaus Schmidt died of a heart attack a year later in 2014. But he didn't have a heart attack when he saw me turning up on the site unannounced. He knew who I was, and often archaeologists actually send me away when I turn up at archaeological sites, or turn their backs as though they're going to catch some dreadful disease if they get close to me. But not Klaus Schmidt. Klaus Schmidt welcomed me to the site. He spent 3 days showing me around in detail. I really appreciate the decency of that man and his dedication. And something else as well. Göbekli Tepe was actually originally found by American archaeologists in early 1950s. They were doing a survey looking for prehistoric material, and it looked promising because they found lots of flints on the surface. It looked like a prehistoric site, but then they saw a bit of a column sticking out of the ground, very beautifully cut T-shaped column, and they said, nah, that's not Stone Age. That's a Byzantine cemetery. So they didn't actually take it any further. Their loss was Klaus Schmidt's gain. He went back to that site in 1996, and he started to dig up those columns, and lo and behold, no, not a Byzantine ceremony, 11,600-year-old megaliths. So Schmidt is telling me two things here. The first thing he's telling me is that this site is not buried by natural sedimentation. This site has been deliberately buried. After being founded 11,600 years ago, it ran for about 1,000 years, and then they shut it down. And you have to envisage the scale of the operation. Teams of people bringing buckets filled with rubble and earth, pouring them into the stone circles, filling them up, covering them completely, and then actually completing a whole hill over the top of it. That's what Göbekli Tepe means in the Turkish language, pot-bellied hill. And that's all anybody thought it was for the next 10,000 years after it was buried, until Klaus Schmidt began the excavation. That's the first thing. The second thing he's telling me, pointing vehemently at the ground, is that they've only excavated 1/50th of the total area of Göbekli Tepe. 50 times as much as we're already seeing is still under the ground. Hundreds and hundreds of stone pillars identified by ground-penetrating radar. I said, when are you going to excavate it? He said, perhaps we will never excavate it. To me, this is tragic. This site has the secrets. It's a time capsule that has the secrets of our past buried within it. It desperately needs to be excavated. So, in brief, I don't think we have a sudden, mysteriously precocious invention of megalithic architecture and agriculture amongst hunter-gatherers 11,600 years ago. I think we have a transfer of technology. I think Göbekli Tepe speaks to a people who came there who already knew everything that was needed about site organization, astronomical alignments, quarrying megaliths and erecting them on a large site, and who already knew everything they needed to about agriculture. And I think they used Göbekli Tepe. Actually, Klaus Schmidt used this phrase to me, that Göbekli Tepe appears to have been a center of innovation, that around it innovations took place. Well, that's what you'd expect with a transfer of technology, that innovations, this is the beginning of agriculture as we know it. And of course, it's not alone. Göbekli Tepe is just 50 miles away. There's another site called Karahan Tepe, where we can see the T-shaped pillars sticking out of the ground. They're actually in a farmer's backyard. They're completely ignored. Nobody's looking at them. How much more do the soils of Turkey have to teach us about our lost and forgotten past? And we shouldn't forget that Göbekli Tepe lies between the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Mesopotamia, between two rivers. Those are the two rivers of ancient Mesopotamia, the Tigris and the Euphrates. And Göbekli Tepe is right up there in the headwater area. So is it possible that there's some kind of flow on from Göbekli Tepe into the historical civilization of ancient Sumer, ancient Mesopotamia? Interestingly enough, Madeleine Danes, this is not my find. Do you see what she sees? Do you see this T-shaped thing here? Do you see that? T-shaped megalith with a circular enclosure. And actually there's another two of them here. Well, this is very odd because this is found on a tablet dated to 3500 BC, thousands of years after Göbekli Tepe. It suggests that some knowledge or information about Göbekli Tepe was passed down, was transmitted into the Sumerian period. And there we find ourselves with the incredible story of Oannes, the bringer of civilization. And the seven Apkallu, the seven sages. These are why I use the title Magicians of the Gods, because that's what the Apkallu were. They were the magicians of the gods. So they're the bringers of civilization. Oddly, they wear fishes on their heads. And I never grow tired of pointing out, they also carry these funny little man bags. You see the man bags? They're all carrying these funny little bags, like handbags. You can actually find three-dimensional versions of them. Now, the odd thing is that if you cross the Atlantic Ocean and you go to the oldest site in Mexico that shows an image of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, the civilization bringer to Central America, you will find that in the coils of this serpent is a figure holding exactly one of those same bags. And I'm beginning to wonder whether that's some kind of badge of office or some kind of symbol whereby a group of people who literally wandered the world spreading civilization, something that they recognized one another with. Because oddly enough, those handbags turn up at Göbekli Tepe. They turn up on Pillar 43 in Enclosure D, where we know they're 11,600 years old. This is an idea that seems to have been passed down in time, and specifically in ancient Mesopotamia. Now, there's a fantastic city which is thought to only be about 4,000 years old in that area called Haran. And Haran was populated by a people called the Sabians. They were known as star worshippers. What's left of ancient Haran now is nothing. The original Temple of the Moon is gone. But interestingly, the symbol of the Temple of the Moon, the crescent moon and disk that you can see here, that exact same symbol, I don't know where I'm going with this. Yeah, that exact same symbol occurs at Göbekli Tepe, the crescent and the disk, but thousands of years earlier. The Sabians of Haran were allowed by Islam during the time of the Holy Wars. They practiced what Islam regarded as a pagan religion, but they were allowed to maintain their religion, unlike anybody else. They inferred that they had a prophet, that he was Hermes, which is the Greek name for Thoth, the ancient Egyptian god of wisdom. And for a few centuries, they were allowed to continue with their Temple of the Moon and their worship of the stars, as it was put. Until finally Islam got heavy and they came in and they smashed up the Sabians of Haran, and they put a huge mosque there. And that's the remnants that we now see of the mosque. And interestingly enough, the one surviving minaret of the mosque is still to this day referred to as the astronomical tower. So is there some hangover from the past in Haran that we can take a look at? Well, interestingly enough, it turns out that the Sabians, those people of Haran, made an annual pilgrimage to the pyramids of Giza every year, right up into our age, right up into the 1100s, the 1200s. The Arab geographer Yaqut al-Hamawi gives the dimensions of the two largest of the Giza pyramids in his geographical dictionary and adds to both of them, the Sabians made their pilgrimage. Salim Hassan even suggests that the name Sabian may be taken from the ancient Egyptian word Sabah, which means star. Whatever the origin of their name may have been, the fact remains that they fully recognized the pyramids as being monuments connected with the stellar cult and revered them as places of pilgrimage. So there is Giza, and certainly it's an astronomical site. I mean, you don't take a 6 million ton, 481 foot high monument and align it to within 3/60ths of a single degree of true north without using astronomy. This is just obvious. And the site is situated on a significant latitude, 30 degrees north, 1/3 of the way between the equator and the North Pole. Again, you need astronomy to do that. The site is speaking to our planet, but it's doing so in the language of astronomy. So perhaps it's not surprising that the Sabian so-called star worshippers were very interested in Giza in Egypt. And again, Egyptologists know this, by the way, but they say it's entirely a coincidence. If you take the height of the Great Pyramid and multiply it by 43,200, you get the polar radius of the Earth. And if you measure carefully the base perimeter of the Great Pyramid and multiply it by 43,200, you get the equatorial circumference of the Earth. In other words, it appears to be a three-dimensional scale model of a hemisphere. It encodes the dimensions of our planet. In all those millennia of darkness, when we didn't even know we lived on a planet at all, let alone what its dimensions are, all we ever needed to do was go to Giza, measure the Great Pyramid, scale up by 43,200, and we have the dimensions of the Earth. It's a complete coincidence, says Egyptology. Total accident. What's that number, 43,200 anyway? I mean, you just pick any number out of a hat, you know. Well, actually, it's not picked out of a hat. 43,200 is a significant number. It isn't a random number. It's a number generated by this phenomenon, which is called precession. The little GIF is modeling precession, this wobble on the axis of the Earth. We all know our pole star, right? It's called Polaris. What is the pole star? It's the star that the extended north pole of the Earth points most directly at. But if the extended north pole of the Earth is doing this in the heavens over a very long cycle, it follows that it won't always point at Polaris. Sometimes it'll point at empty space. Sometimes it'll point at another star. And indeed, ancient cultures recognized different pole stars at different times in the past. So that's one area at the pole of the heavens where precession is observed. And this process unfolds at the rate of roughly 1 degree every 72 years. 1 degree every 72 years. The other place it's visible is on the horizon, where the zodiacal constellations house the sun month by month. It's not an accident that the early Christians used the fish as their symbol. We are living at the end of the age of Pisces. The early Christians were living at the beginning of the age of Pisces. Because why? The constellation Pisces houses the sun at dawn on the spring equinox. The sun is rising against the background of the constellation of Pisces. But because of this wobble on the axis of the Earth, the constellation of Pisces is being shifted out of alignment, and what is shifting in? We live in the dawning of the age of Aquarius. This is the process of precession. It operates at the rate of 1 degree every 72 years. 30 degrees, one house of the zodiac, will cost you 2,160 years. The whole cycle, 360 degrees, which brings it back to starting point, 25,920 years. And that issue has been thoroughly and intensely investigated by Professor Giorgio de Santillana, professor of the history of science at MIT, formerly, and Hertha von Desch, the historian of science from Germany. Hamlet's Mill, amazing book, almost impossible to read. I had to read it 5 times. I still have my notes. Finally, I got it. Finally, I found the time bombs that they were hiding within that text. What they, if we could take the little picture of me off the screen, I just would appreciate that. What they're saying is that no, the Greeks didn't discover precession. This knowledge was known thousands of years before the Greeks. They actually trace the origins of the system to some almost unbelievable ancestor civilization of prehistoric antiquity that first dared to understand the world as created according to number, measure, and weight. They thoroughly document this. Myths from all around the world contain that sequence of numbers based on the number 72. You can take 72 and add half of 72 to it. You get 108. 72 plus 36 is 108. Divided by 2 is 54. These are all part of the precessional sequence. 10,000. There are 432,000 syllables in the Rig Veda. Osiris was captured by Seth and his 72 assistants. And that's why 43,200 isn't a random number, because it's a precessional number. It's 600 times 72. You know, you want to create a very large monument. You could have, which models the Earth, you could have done it at the scale of 1 to 57,000 or 1 to 38,000, but you chose 1 to 43,200 for your big monument. That can't be an accident. They are giving us the dimensions of the Earth on a scale provided by a key motion of the Earth itself. That is clever processing and sending of information to the future. And the system's not only expressed in myth, it's in architecture, the avenues of statues at Angkor in Cambodia, 108 in each avenue, 54 on each side. And they are churning the Milky Ocean, by the way. That's the serpent Vasuki wrapped around Mount Mandara. And they're churning the Milky Ocean for Amrita, the elixir of immortality. That churning motif and a serpent being involved is very indicative of precession. And you know, I mean, actually, in a sense, who gives a damn when the Hoover Dam was built? But the fact of the matter is that there's a precessional work of art built into the Hoover Dam. It's a huge piece that is there. And the artist, Oscar Hansen, who was responsible for the star map set into the floor of the monument, believed that in remote ages to come, intelligent people with knowledge of precession would be able to discern the astronomical time of the dam's dedication. In other words, you don't want to trust your information to a written document that you're going to send down to the future. Nobody might read that text. The document might not survive. You want to use a universal language, the language of astronomy, and a massive piece of architecture that's going to last. And oddly enough, that's what happened at the Hoover Dam, that it is designed, it freezes the skies above the dam at the date of the dam's completion, and truly, yes, in the future, that would be enough information to work out when the dam was made. So that's what I'm suggesting, that it's the same thing at Giza. That Giza is, like the Hoover Dam, it contains an astronomical imprint that spells out a very specific date. That's the 3 great pyramids of Giza, of course. And down here, this little fella down here that I'm just outlining, that's the Great Sphinx, 270 feet long and 70 feet high. And it's overlooking the Nile Valley. That's the Nile Valley off to the side. And here's the Great Sphinx, and my God, it looks ancient, sitting there on the Giza Plateau. You know, and just for reference, I mean, here's Giza and here's Göbekli Tepe. Okay, so Robert Schoch and John Anthony West. The initial insight came from John Anthony West. John Anthony West looked at the erosion of the Sphinx. A great man, by the way, John Anthony West. And thanks to anybody here who contributed to the crowdfunding campaign for John, because John had a massive metastasized lung cancer. And we all thought we were going to lose him. But the crowdfunding campaign made it possible for him to go to the alternative clinic, the Brzezinski Clinic, and he refused chemo and radiotherapy, of course, and the result is that his cancer is now in remission. Most amazing story. So it was John who had this insight, and he brought Professor Robert Schoch of Boston University to Giza to give a geological opinion. What is the nature of this peculiar erosion that we see in the trench around the Sphinx? Because you see, the Sphinx was made by cutting out the bedrock around it, and separating the core body in this trench. Now, the core body has been covered with restoration. They were even restoring it in the Old Kingdom. How come they're restoring it in the Old Kingdom if it's built in the Old Kingdom? They're restoring it, they're still restoring it today, but where you can see very clearly the erosion is in the surrounding trench. And that is classic precipitation-induced weathering. I'm sure Robert Schoch will be making his own detailed case on this, but the fact is that there were no such rains in Egypt 5,000 years ago. You have to go back actually to the Younger Dryas to find the kind of rains in Egypt that could have caused this erosion on the Sphinx. So John and Robert Schoch, they went to the Geological Society of America in 1992 with their evidence, and they presented it there. And most of the geologists immediately saw the point of the evidence. Who didn't see the point were Egyptologists, Mark Lehner and Zahi Hawass. They dismissed the whole thing on behalf of the world of Egyptology, and their argument was basically as follows. There isn't a monument anywhere in the world that is 12,000 years old. If a culture was capable of creating the Sphinx, surely it would have created other monuments, but we don't find any. Therefore, obviously, the Sphinx is the work of the ancient Egyptians. Well, of course, they could say that in 1992, but they can't say it today, not when we have Göbekli Tepe, which is around 12,000 years old, and if you can build Göbekli Tepe, you can certainly make the Sphinx. The Great Sphinx, which gazes due east. This is the back of the Sphinx's head. When you get up on the Sphinx's back illegally, you get the Sphinx's point of view. Should you be up there illegally on the summer solstice, the sun will be way over here, well to the north of east. Winter solstice, the sun is way over here, well to the south of east. But if you get up on the Sphinx's back on the spring equinox, 21st of March, that's when you find what the Sphinx was intended to do. The Sphinx gazes exactly at the rising sun on the equinox. It is perfectly through east, and that's what it is. It's an equinoctial marker. It's speaking to the equinox and to the constellation that lies behind the sun on the equinox. It's speaking to the equinox, and it is marrying heaven and earth on that day. And here's the funny thing. If the Sphinx was built in 2500 BC, I don't know if you know this, but 2500 BC was the age of Taurus. The constellation of Taurus housed the sun. Ancient Egyptian iconography in the age of Taurus around the epoch of 2500 BC was all about bulls. If the ancient Egyptians had wanted to create an equinoctial marker in the age of Taurus, they would have made it in the shape of a bull, not in the shape of a lion. So when does a lion house the sun on the equinox? Computer software gives us the answer. A lion housed the sun on the equinox exactly during the Younger Dryas, 12,800 to 11,600 years ago. The Sphinx is not only looking at the rising sun, the Sphinx is looking at its own celestial counterpart in the heavens. All of us who work on this believe that the Sphinx originally had the head of a lion, that it was recarved in pharaonic times into the human head that we see today. 3 Great Pyramids. That's the Great Pyramid, half a course of masonry on the front. On the top left, we don't know if it was ever completed. And me on top of the Great Pyramid with the second pyramid behind. That's where I found my granddad's graffiti. 1 step down, P. Hancock, 5th of April, 1916. My grandpa's diary, 5th of April, 1916, climbed Great Pyramid today. He was a chaplain with British forces. And here's Robert Bauval, who's also speaking here at Contact. And I want to just pay huge tribute to Robert Bauval. He is the Giordano Bruno of our times. I mean, this is a man who has just cracked the astronomical code wide open, and boy, has he taken stick from the mainstream for doing that. But Robert's Orion correlation, don't listen to anybody who tells you it's been refuted. This correlation has never been refuted except in the fantasy minds of a few archaeologists. This correlation is very, very real. Robert found the Orion correlation. He was the first person to notice the remarkable similarity between the 3 pyramids on the ground and the 3 stars of Orion's belt. And oddly enough, as you go into the software and the simulations more and more carefully, you find that the alignment only becomes perfect, not in 2,500 BC, but in 10,500 BC, 12,500 years ago. And that's exactly the time that the Sphinx is looking at Leo. And indeed, as the sun bisects the horizon, Leo rises higher in the sky, and that's the moment that, like the hand of a clock, the constellation of Orion sits due south on the meridian in exactly the pattern of the three Great Pyramids. I don't believe it's a coincidence. I think that we are looking at a date stamp for the date that we call 12,500 years ago, smack in the Younger Dryas. And if we go back to Haran, I'm running short of time, so I'm not going to read you all this. This is Thabit ibn Qurra, amazing Haranian geographer and mathematician, wrote this paean to paganism at the time. I'd love to read it, but you can read it yourselves. He worked a lot with right triangles. A 3, 4, 5 right triangle is a triangle that has its sides in the dimensions 3, 4, and 5, and that has a right angle in the triangle. When you have a 3, 4, 5 right triangle, the acute angle is 36.87 degrees, okay? Now, here's the curious thing. We talked about Giza and how it gives us the circumference of the Earth, how it gives us the dimensions of the Earth. Here's the King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid. Oddly enough, again, I don't have time to go into details except to just show you briefly how it works. There is a 3, 4, 5 right triangle in the King's Chamber. And here is the point that I wish to get to. Anthropologist and archaeologist James Q. Jacobs was the first to notice something absolutely stunning about Haran. Haran, this place famed for its knowledge of the stars, for its measuring of the Earth, for its cosmography, for its use of 3, 4, 5 right triangles in trigonometry. This site is situated on latitude 36.87 degrees north, which is the acute angle in a right triangle. That can't be an accident. That site was deliberately located on that latitude, and it has been associated with triangles that generate that number ever since. And something else even more puzzling. I'll let J.Q. Jacobs speak for himself. Even non-archaeos understand stratification and deposition basics. Deeper is older. Göbekli Tepe is 12,000 years old. Haran is equated with Ur of Sumeria, the civilized land and a cradle of civilization. That cradle in astronomy is presumed to be 4,000 to 5,000 years old, not 12,000. Haran is located at 3/4 Atan latitude, a fixed parameter. And Göbekli Tepe is at a specific latitude difference north. Göbekli Tepe, it turns out, is 1/1000th of the Earth's circumference north, latitude difference north of Göbekli Tepe. Because the fixed parameter must come first, the conundrum, of course, is that this precise 1/1000th of circumference latitude difference is either a coincidence or ancient astronomy just took a leap back to 12,000 years. And I think that's the case. I think we're looking at the fingerprints of a huge ancient astronomical endeavor. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe must cause us to question the dating of all other megalithic sites around the world. It helps us to understand this one in the Sicily Channel, which was covered by the rising sea waters almost 10,000 years ago. It must cause us to question the age of 3,000 or 4,000 years that's given to the T-shaped megaliths of Minorca in the Balearic Islands. They look exactly like Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe is unique because the site was sealed and deliberately buried. All these other megalithic sites have been contaminated with later dates by other cultures that have come across them. You can't date stone. You can only date organic material associated with the stone. And that organic material can give you falsely young dates if it's been introduced by later cultures. The general appearance of Göbekli Tepe is so similar to the Maltese megalithic temples. Again, I've argued since 2002 that the Maltese megalithic temples are wrongly dated, that they go back into the Upper Paleolithic, that they're more than 12,000 years old. Baalbek in the Lebanon. I'm sitting in the middle of the Temple of Jupiter. The Temple of Jupiter is undoubtedly a Roman temple, but is surrounded by this weird U-shaped megalithic wall, which doesn't actually join the temple. Some bits have been filled in, but it's separate from the temple. And I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, except to say that the temple platform is entirely composed of relatively small stones. But when you look down over the edge on the north side, you see this freestanding giant megalithic wall. So you could see the temple platform, nothing very major there, and then these really big megaliths in the surrounding wall, which also continues on the south side. And there I'm in it for scale. You get a sense of the size of these megaliths, how different they are from the rest of the temple. It's on the west side that you find the trilithon. Each of these 3 blocks weighs 900 tons. They are separated from each other by such a minimal distance that you literally can't put a sheet of paper into the gap between the joints. They are raised more than 20 feet above the ground. And all of it, according to archaeologists, is supposed to have been the work of the Romans. All the Roman work. And their killer argument for saying why it's Roman work is this rather dark block in front of my right foot. When it's excavated, it turns out to be a Roman column drum. It actually does definitely come from a Roman column. There's no doubt about it. We can't deny that. It's sitting there in the foundations of the wall. And the archaeologists say, look, we've got a Roman temple on top. We've got a Roman column drum in the bottom. Pretty obvious the Romans did everything. Is it? Really? I'm not sure, because Baalbek was used as a fortress for hundreds and hundreds of years. It was besieged during the Crusades. Genghis Khan took it at one point. Huge instruments, those catapults, were sent to fire rocks against the walls. Teams of sappers were sent to undermine the walls. I think we're looking at a repair block. I think this was a repair to the devastated fortress of Baalbek. And they used a bit of a Roman column that was lying around and slotted it into place where an attempt had been made to undermine the foundations. And in fact, there's another wall definitely built by the Arabs at Baalbek where a Roman column is also redeployed. And when you compare that Roman column with the one in the foundations, you can see that it's the same kind of workmanship. The biggest blocks are in the quarry. This is the stone of the pregnant woman, 1,000 tons, cleanly separated from the bedrock here. And across the road, used as a rubbish dump, another giant block, 1,200 tons, but the biggest of all was only found in June 2014. And that's funny because the German Archaeological Institute has been working on the site for 100 years. Yet it wasn't until June 2014 that they found this one. Why? Because it was covered by sediment. This one actually weighs, that's the front end bit there, I'm standing on it here, actually weighs 1,400 tons. It's a giant piece of rock and all perfectly cut and quarried. So here's the Orthodox view. The Romans cut and quarried those blocks, but they found they were just too heavy to move. The 900-ton blocks, they could move those, but 1,000 tons above, they couldn't move them. So having gone to all the trouble of cutting and quarrying them perfectly, they just abandoned them in the quarry. In my view, a very un-Roman thing to do. The Romans were pragmatists. Let's say, okay, they cut these huge blocks, they found they couldn't move them. Would they have left them there? No. They had a temple to build. They would have sawn the blocks up like loaves of bread into smaller blocks. They've already done a lot of the work. Why waste time quarrying more blocks when you've got these already cut out? And they would have taken them over in manageable sizes and used them in the temple. The fact they didn't do so suggests to me the Romans never knew these blocks were there, that the whole place was covered by sediment in their time, and that we are looking at a prehistoric remnant at Baalbek. Ollantaytambo, in the Peruvian Andes, you begin to see, again, blocks on this similar extraordinary scale and just the amazing fitting together of them. I mean, this is opticians' work on a scale of acres that we're seeing up here. Was it really all made by the Incas? Is this Sacsayhuaman all the work of a culture that just had 200 years to put everything together before the Spanish came? Or is it possible that the ancient traditions of the area are right and that the Incas simply overbuilt upon pre-existing megalithic structures? Today, students are taught that it's all the work of the Incas. But again, I go into this in depth in Magicians of the Gods. I mean, that is that monster block there. I'm standing beside it for scale. 300 odd tons, fitted together like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. Everything's so close fitting you can't get anything between the joints. It's almost like they made this stuff soft and molded it together like Play-Doh. And then made this gigantic site. Then we go to Tiwanaku. I'm having to rush through because I'm nearing the end of my time. Tiwanaku in Bolivia, giant megaliths, again up to the range of 300 to 400 tons. I'm standing beside one of them here. what do we see in the background? What we see in the background are some funny-looking blocks. Let's get closer. Oh, they're H-shaped blocks. They look almost like they're the end pieces of something. It's like something, maybe something metal was joined together by these pieces. The funny thing, however, is that that precise same symbol, which we call the letter H, appears at Göbekli Tepe on the belts of those figures, because those T-shaped megaliths, they're not just megaliths, they all have arms and hands, and they all have belts. They represent human figures. So the same iconography turns up at Göbekli Tepe and at Tiwanaku. And here we're looking down on the Kalas Asiya and the Akapana Pyramid from an extremely cold aircraft with the windows open at 18,000 feet. Boy, did we have altitude sickness after that. In the Kalas Asiya is the gateway of the sun. It's down in that corner, and this is the outline of this amazing structure, the Kalas Asiya. When you look closer, you see that the Kalas Asiya the wall is actually defined by a series of megalithic stones, like any megalithic site around the world. When we get closer, you can see those megalithic stones again. You can see that they're sticking up and there's a wall between them. Turns out the wall is entirely a modern archaeological fantasy. That's what they think it should have looked like. All we know for sure is that this marks out the original perimeter, this row of huge, very ancient-looking megaliths. The gateway of the sun plays with the sun, especially at the solstice. And it turns out that the alignment of the gateway of the sun to the solstice sunrise, you again have to go back to the epoch of 10,000 BC in order to get the alignment perfect. One of those megalithic pillars in the semi-subterranean temple has a human face carved on the front of it. That face is distinctly bearded with these mustachios and a spade-shaped beard. Very unusual amongst American Indians to have a bearded figure. But there it is, and it is said to represent Viracocha, the civilizer who brings civilization to the Andes after a time of flood. On the side of the head of that figure is this little animal. We've outlined it here. It doesn't represent any known species of animal today, but it's very like Toxodon that became extinct during the Younger Dryas. And Viracocha's travels take him to Ecuador, where he crosses the Pacific Ocean. Lo and behold, off that coast, a completely neglected discovery back in the 1960s, man-made pillars lying on the bottom of the seabed. Easter Island, figures are dated to about 700 or 800 years ago by archaeology. They can't date the figures themselves, so what they do is they take organic material out of the platform on which the figures stand. As you can see, in the platform on which the figures stand is a reused Easter Island head. You see that? Well, that alone tells us that the heads are older, the statues are older than the walls. They used a bit of one in the wall. So it's not reliable to take organic material out of the wall and say that's the date of the statues at all. When you go to the quarry, you see this surreal sight of these hundreds of statues just sort of standing up out of the quarry. You might think they just go down a few feet under the ground, but actually they go down 30 feet under the ground. Thor Heyerdahl, who I had the privilege to know, was the first to point this out, that he excavated this figure and it goes down 30 feet. Frank Joseph in 2006 was the first to raise a question mark over that. What does it mean? 30 feet of sedimentation? How long does that take to build up on a place like Easter Island? Robert Schock has worked on this, and as a geologist, he's really sure that it takes thousands of years to build up that level of sedimentation in Easter Island. I think if Thor had known about Göbekli Tepe, he would have been intrigued by the similarity of the hand positions of the Göbekli Tepe figures and the Easter Island figures, the hands meeting in front of the belly with this belt underneath. And interestingly enough, the tradition is that civilization was brought to Easter Island by 7 initiated men, the 7 sages again. And obviously these are bearded figures. I mean, those aren't just huge chins, those are bearded figures. So we go through the gamut of these bearded figures. I really have to rush. Osiris himself, The problem with all of this is that the House of History has been built without taking account of the Younger Dryas cataclysm. And I would suggest that means the House of History is built on foundations of sand. That unless it takes a global cataclysm right at the beginning of the so-called Neolithic into account, we are never going to get the story straight. I'm going to have to just rush past all this on the Americas, the new evidence that's coming out about the peopling of the Americas. Our good year there, a 50,000-year-old site. But the question I want to close is with, I think we have legitimately raised questions over the origins of civilization. What about the future of civilization? And I guarantee you I'll do this in 3.5 minutes. Because, you know, NASA often makes reassuring statements. I'm not here to spread gloom and doom. I'm here to spread positivity, by the way. NASA often makes reassuring statements about our cosmic environment. Says that no, none of the potentially hazardous asteroids it's identified are going to hit the Earth in the next 100 years. That's true. The problem is the potentially hazardous asteroids it hasn't identified. And the estimates are that there's about 100,000 of them out there. In other words, we've only identified 1% of these potentially hazardous asteroids. And actually, are we getting wake-up calls from the universe? 2013, Chelyabinsk. 2014, NASA on alert as huge asteroid skims past the Earth. 2016, 3 reports unexpectedly whizzed by. Hours after discovery, asteroid swept by. An asteroid zipped through Earth's shadow last night. Rerun asteroid buzzes Earth in second close shave in 2017. You know, we continue. February 2017, NASA warns that asteroid larger than the Empire State Building could smash into the Earth. Dublin heart rates watch as St. Patrick's Day asteroid comes dangerously close to the Earth in an extraordinary NASA video. Gibraltar-sized space rock passes the Earth. NASA seems to be waking up to this, that there's some issue out there that we need to pay attention to. Scientists all around the world are waking up to it, and the focus is this bloody torrid meteor stream. That is the single most dangerous collision hazard facing the Earth today. I liken it to strapping on a blindfold and crossing an 8-lane interstate twice a year and just praying that we don't meet any traffic. And if we do, let it be motorcycles rather than trucks. Because that's what's happening. The torrid meteor stream is 30 million kilometers wide. That's why it takes the Earth 12 days to pass through it, because we travel at 2.5 million kilometers a day on our orbital path. 30 million kilometers wide, filled with filaments of debris. There are already identified big objects in there. Comet Encke is the best known. Interesting that it's called Comet Encke. It's the largest fragment still visible of the original giant comet that made up the torrid meteor stream, but it's not alone. There's Comet Olgiato, Comet Rudnicki, all in the range of 2 to 5 kilometers in diameter. There are also between 1 and 200 asteroids of more than 1 kilometer in diameter orbiting within the torrid meteor stream. And the scientists think that one of them may be as much as 30 kilometers in diameter. They've done a calculation of the mass of debris. This unique complex of debris is undoubtedly the greatest collision hazard facing the Earth at the present time. And we don't have to have gloom and doom, because as a matter of fact, we already have the technology to solve this problem. We already have it. It's only a matter of priorities. Right now, the big bucks goes to military expenditure. Limitless trillions of dollars can be raised to invent ever more sophisticated ways to murder and destroy one another on this planet, to make us forget that we are all brothers and sisters, that every human has a right to life. We seek to inflict, when I say we, everybody's at this mad game of destruction that's going on in the world. Yet our cosmic environment is seething with danger, and we're paying absolutely no attention to it at all, while we look for ways to destroy one another as a species. The technology already exists to sweep our cosmic environment clean. And I'll close on this note. Of course, when you live in a brightly lit city, you never see the stars. Light pollution cuts it down. But if you go up in a NASA satellite and look down on the Earth, you will see the effects of electrification. You'll see that Northern Europe is brightly lit. But much of Africa is dark. This is taken as a sign of the progress of technology. The brightly lit areas have progressed. The other areas haven't got electricity yet. And the same in the Western Hemisphere. There's North America, like a chain of jewels, and the Amazon basin is almost completely dark. And we have hunter-gatherers in the Amazon who don't even know our culture exists. I mean, they see an airplane going overhead and they think, what the hell is that? You know? We live in a world where there are hunter-gatherers coexisting with an advanced technological civilization. If an event like the Younger Dryas impact were to happen today, who would survive? Would it be us, with our technology, with our dependence on specialisms? Actually, very few of us know how to survive at all. We are kept alive by a complex internetwork of specializations. Everybody does their bit, and that's civilization. We have lost the psychic resources to face a catastrophe. We're not armored mentally against that. Human beings would certainly survive, but I don't think our civilization would survive such a cataclysm. I think we'd be into a Walking Dead scenario within about 2 weeks. Everything would fall apart. There would be no food in the cities. It would be awful. But who would survive? Triumph would be the hunter-gatherers, because they're in the business of survival. That's what they do all the time. An event like this would just go over their heads. They would get through. Some of us might even settle amongst them, seeking their help, seeking their refuge, and we might teach them something of what we know if we happen to be individuals who knew stuff worth teaching. And who's to say 10,000 or 11,000 years from now that the descendants of those hunter-gatherers would not be passing down a quote-unquote myths. The archaeologists of the time would call it a myth. A myth about how there was once a great civilization that lived on this planet, so advanced that they were almost like gods. They could send men to the moon. They could fly around the planet in a matter of hours. They could speak to one another and see one another on opposite sides of the earth. But they became cruel. They became arrogant. They began to impose their will on others around them. They developed an overweening pride in their own achievements. They ceased to bear their prosperity with moderation, and the universe slapped them down. Let's make sure we're not the next lost civilization. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
All right, that was great, Graham Hancock. Sometimes when I watch a lot of these things, I don't really. I'm kind of following in on what the presentation is, and then certain things that are covered kind of overlap with something else that I've been looking at. And a good example of that is the numbers 1/72, and he made a reference to I think it was Osiris and Set, about there being 72 something, maybe it was virgins, but there's also if you remember Thoth, I can't remember, I can't say his name correctly. Wagered a bet that if he won, he would get 172, 1 out of 72 of the moon's light, and he used that to make sure that Nut can be impregnated to give birth to the 5 deities. So that's pretty interesting, the numbers that overlap. And so what I remembered that I forgot to show earlier is let's look at the calculator. All right, crap. So it was 365 days times 52 is 18,980, and that's also divisible by 260, which was the Tzolk'in, which is 73. But of course, if you get to 360 times 52. But you divide it by 260. It doesn't. Oh, it's 72. Isn't that interesting? So you get that extra 1. I wonder what that. Anyways, I don't know. Sometimes I just keep doing weird math in my head. That doesn't necessarily mean that's good math or actually relates to anything. Sorry. For the commercials, I was kind of trying to heal my back with some heat pads, but meant me having to get up. But I brought the heat pads down here. Okay, it's very late. It's been 3 hours and 22 minutes, and there's also the other thing. It takes a lot of my time, but that's okay. I think I like having this around for other people to kind of watch and listen and think and just keep their minds open. Dwell on it a little bit. Think about it a little bit. Don't believe in it. Either debunk it and move on, or just information. It's the same. Okay, that's it. Thank you, everyone, and good night.